Everyone knows Peter Griffin is the dumb one, an IQ just below the line for mental disability, and a lifetime of decisions to match. But the strangest thing about the Griffins is, Peter isn't the worst offender. A genius baby destroyed his time machine and got his best friend killed. In this video, we break down the Griffins' dumbest moments. Section 1. The day Peter Griffin got tested. Peter Griffin has been making terrible decisions since the very first episode of Family Guy. He lost his job at a toy factory by falling asleep drunk at work. He once bought volcano insurance from a door-to-door salesman, despite living in Quahog, Rhode Island, a city that has never in its history been anywhere near volcanic activity. He mistook a salesman for an answering machine in that same episode, treating the man's increasingly confused responses as a recorded greeting and leaving a message before walking away satisfied. These are not isolated incidents. They are the baseline, the everyday operating standard of a man who moves through the world with absolute confidence and almost no understanding of how it works. For the first few seasons of the show, this was played as a running joke with no deeper explanation. Peter was dumb the way sitcom dads are dumb. Exaggerated, cartoonish, harmless. He was bumbling in the tradition of Homer Simpson or Al Bundy, a man too thick to understand his own limitations, too cheerful to care. The writers kept things loose. His stupidity was a tool they picked up and put down as needed. Sometimes Peter could barely operate a door. Other times, he demonstrated enough cunning to pull off elaborate schemes. The inconsistency was the point, because the point was always the laugh, never the logic. Season 4 changed that. Specifically, Episode 6 of Season 4, which aired on June 19, 2005, and carries the title Petarded. It is the episode where the show stopped treating Peter's low intelligence as a vague character trait and made it a medical fact. Not just a gag, not just a running implication, but a clinical diagnosis delivered by a professional in an official setting. Peter Griffin, patriarch of the Griffin family, resident of Quahog, Rhode Island, employee of the Pawtucket Brewery, was declared legally and officially mentally disabled. The test said so. The doctor said so. The state said so. The episode begins at game night. The Griffins have the neighbors over for Trivial Pursuit, which is the kind of wholesome domestic setup the show uses to lull the audience before pulling the rug out. The version being played is the standard adult edition, and Peter is struggling badly. Lois, watching her husband flounder, quietly switches out his question cards. She replaces them with cards from the preschool edition of the game, the version designed for children who are still learning what color the sky is. Peter does not notice. Peter answers the preschool questions with confidence and wins the round. He believes he has beaten everyone at a game of general knowledge and intelligence. What follows is one of the most precisely constructed comedic setups in the show's run. Peter, now convinced he is smarter than the people around him, becomes insufferable. He talks down to his friends. He lectures Brian on topics he knows nothing about. He moves through the house with a new arrogance, referring to himself in the way a person who has just discovered they are secretly brilliant might talk, which is to say, badly and inaccurately. Brian, who has watched this transformation unfold and knows exactly what Lois did with those question cards, reaches his limit. He challenges Peter to prove it. If Peter is so smart, Brian says, he should apply for the MacArthur Fellows Program, the grant awarded to people of exceptional intellectual achievement. Take the test, Brian says. Make it official. Peter agrees. He is thrilled. The idea that a formal test might expose him as the genius he already believes himself to be is deeply appealing. He sits down with genuine enthusiasm and completes the examination. The results come back, and they are not what Peter expected. They are not what anyone with even a passing familiarity with Peter Griffin's decision-making would have expected, which is to say, they confirm the opposite of genius. His score places him below the threshold for average intelligence, below the threshold for below average intelligence, and into territory the Rhode Island State Office of Mental Health classifies as intellectual disability. The doctor explains this to Peter with a chart. He points to where Peter's score lands relative to the line. Peter, in a moment that manages to be both absurd and strangely poignant, corrects the doctor on which side of the line he means. The doctor, a professional trained in the field, nearly loses his composure at being corrected on a basic directional distinction by the man he has just diagnosed. Peter's IQ, according to the episode, sits just below 70. That number matters because 70 has historically been used in clinical and legal contexts as a rough threshold, below which certain assessments and supports become relevant. The show does not use this information carefully or sensitively. It is 2005, and the episode is being made for an adult animated comedy on Fox. But the number grounds the joke in something concrete. This is no longer a vague implication. Peter Griffin has been formally evaluated and found to fall below a specific, documented measure of cognitive functioning. He is not just a bumbling sitcom dad. The state of Rhode Island has the paperwork. What is interesting about the episode from a character perspective is what Peter does next. He is depressed at first. The diagnosis is a blow to a man who had spent the previous week believing himself to be a genius. But the depression does not last long, because Peter Griffin has always been gifted at finding the silver lining in situations that would devastate a more self-aware person. He realizes that being legally classified as mentally disabled comes with a certain social benefit. People are more forgiving. He can get away with things. He tests this almost immediately when he accidentally knocks down local news anchor Tom Tucker with his car. Tucker recognizes Peter as the man who was recently in the news for his diagnosis and, rather than call the police, lets him go without incident. This is the moment the episode pivots from a comedy about a man getting a bad test result into something a little more uncomfortable. Peter does not use his new legal status to access support or services. He uses it to misbehave. He kicks open doors in the women's restroom. He takes things from places he is not supposed to take things from. He leans into the identity the way someone might lean into any excuse that removes personal responsibility, which is to say, enthusiastically and without a shred of reflection. Things escalate in the way things always escalate with Peter Griffin, which is to say, faster and further than any reasonable person would allow. He decides to steal a deep fryer from a local fast food restaurant. During this attempt, he manages to pour hot grease over Lois, which puts her in the hospital in a full body cast. This is not a comedic inconvenience. She is genuinely seriously injured by her husband's attempt to steal commercial kitchen equipment. With Lois hospitalized, the family home falls under scrutiny from Child Protective Services, and an agent named Jessup decides that a legally designated intellectually disabled adult who just hospitalized his wife while attempting commercial theft is not a suitable primary caregiver. The children are removed. The temporary custody arrangements are themselves a parade of poor judgment. Stewie ends up with Cleveland. Chris ends up with Mort and Muriel Goldman. Meg ends up with Quagmire, who takes her home primarily to stare at her. Brian tells Peter that the only way to get his children back is to demonstrate that he is a capable parent. Peter interprets this as a challenge to make Cleveland look like a bad parent, and his plan to accomplish this is to bring several strangers into Cleveland's home in a way that will look bad to the authorities. The plan does not work. Peter is nearly imprisoned. He eventually escapes this outcome through a combination of luck and the legal system's apparent willingness to cut him an enormous amount of slack. What Petarded accomplished for the show was the formalization of something that had always been true but had never been stated outright. Peter Griffin is not just careless or lazy or poorly informed. He has been evaluated by a professional and found to fall below the clinical threshold for standard cognitive function. The show took its most fundamental character trait, the one that drives almost every plot and almost every joke, and put it on paper. Fans have called what comes after this the Griffin paradox, and it is worth spending a moment on. An IQ in Peter's range, in the real world, would produce consistent and fairly predictable limitations. Peter does not behave consistently. He can, in certain episodes, plan and execute schemes of genuine complexity. He once successfully founded a sovereign nation. He has demonstrated musical ability, mechanical creativity, and an almost preternatural capacity to survive situations that would kill a physically average human being. In other episodes, he forgets how chairs work. He is baffled by mirrors. He cannot process information that a child would process without effort. The writers use his intelligence level as a dial they turn based on what the scene requires. If the joke needs Peter to be incapable of understanding a basic concept, he is incapable of understanding it. If the joke needs Peter to construct an elaborate trap or deliver a perfectly timed monologue, he does that instead. The clinical diagnosis from Petarded does not constrain the character. It contextualizes him, gives the writers official permission to push his incompetence as far as it needs to go in any given moment, while also allowing the occasional flash of unexpected sharpness that makes him feel like more than a one-note joke. What is also worth noting is what the episode reveals about the family's relationship to Peter's limitations. Lois switched those Trivial Pursuit cards. She did it out of kindness, or at least out of a desire to let her husband have a moment of feeling good about himself in front of the neighbors. But the effect of that small act of protection was to set off a chain of events that ended with her in a full-body cast and her children in temporary custody. This is the structure of so many Griffin family disasters. Someone tries to manage Peter, or protect him, or let him have his moment, and then something catches fire. Brian's challenge also deserves examination. Brian called Peter's bluff. He was tired of the arrogance and pushed back against it by encouraging Peter to take a formal test. This was the right instinct and the correct thing to do. It was also the direct cause of every terrible thing that happened in the episode. Peter would not have been diagnosed, would not have sought to exploit that diagnosis, would not have tried to steal a deep fryer, and Lois would not have been injured if Brian had simply let Peter continue believing he won a Trivial Pursuit game his wife had secretly rigged in his favor. The episode ends with Peter retaining custody of his children and life returning to something close to normal. He does not emerge from the experience having learned anything. There is no version of this story where Peter reflects on the events and adjusts his behavior accordingly. The diagnosis remains on record, referenced occasionally in later seasons when the show wants to underline just how low the bar actually is for Peter's decision-making. But in terms of practical effect on his daily life, it changes nothing. He drives home from the trial and almost certainly stops for fast food on the way. That is the engine of the show. Not growth, not consequence, not correction. Just the next thing Peter does, which will be as ill-considered as the last and will probably involve someone getting hurt. There are nearly 500 episodes of Family Guy. Peter has been fired from jobs, caused international incidents, accidentally started fights that leveled city blocks, been declared dead, declared a nation, declared himself various things he is not. He has eaten his way into medical emergencies and talked his way into legal ones. He has, at various points, been a fisherman, a football player, a tobacco lobbyist, a ghostbuster, and the president of a country with a population of 1. None of these things have changed him in any meaningful way. Petarded is the episode that told viewers why. The test did not make Peter dumb. It confirmed what had always been true. The man operating out of that house in Quahog, the one who comes home every night, eats too much, says the wrong thing, and somehow stumbles through catastrophe after catastrophe without genuine consequence, that man has always been exactly what the doctors said he was. A score just below 70, an entire family absorbing the fallout, and not a single lesson learned on the way out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter's diagnosis gave the show official permission to push his incompetence as far as it needed to go. What the next section covers is what that looks like when it turns physical. When the jokes stop being about what Peter thinks and start being about what Peter's body does to him and everyone around him. Section 2. Peter Griffin's body is a weapon against himself. Running home through the streets of Quahog with a silver scroll in hand, Peter Griffin is the happiest man alive. He found the last winning bottle cap hidden in a Pawtucket Patriot Ale during the Season 2 episode Wasted Talent, which means a lifetime supply of free beer is now his. Someone on the street tells him to run home as fast as he can, and the music swells into the instrumental version of a Willy Wonka classic, all golden light and triumphant horns. And Peter runs. He runs with everything he has. He makes it almost all the way home, and then he trips. He hits the ground. He grabs his knee. What follows is nearly 30 seconds of Peter making a sound that is less a word than it is a sustained expression of physical suffering. Arms pinned awkwardly behind him, face twisted into something between agony and theatrical overcommitment. He produces a rising and falling series of short, sharp noises that escalate and then plateau and then escalate again. The music is gone. The triumph is gone. There is only Peter, on the ground, communicating through pure vocal texture that his knee hurts badly. The joke works because it goes on for so long that it stops being about the knee and becomes about the refusal to stop. Most shows would cut away. Family Guy holds on it. The discomfort of watching is the point. That moment from 2000 became one of the most recognized physical gags in the show's history. It recurs across seasons in different forms. Lois suffers a version of it in a later episode. Peter reenacts it in opening title sequences. The Chumbawamba Band, brought in by Pawtucket Pat after Peter gets thrown out of the brewery tour in that same Wasted Talent episode, kicks Peter in the exact same knee, producing the exact same cascade of pained noises. The gag has been adapted into internet memes, recreated in other video games and animations, and referenced in cultural spaces far removed from the show itself. What started as a 30-second overstay on a simple physical joke became a signature. But the knee was just the beginning of what Peter Griffin's body would be put through over the course of more than 20 seasons. Physical comedy on Family Guy operates on a specific principle. Peter's body is treated as something that absorbs unlimited punishment and delivers it in equal measure to everyone nearby. He is big and heavy, and he moves through space with total disregard for the consequences of his trajectory. When he falls in a way that communicates both that it hurts and that he was going to keep doing whatever caused the fall regardless of the warning signs. The show never frames his injuries as lessons. They are events. They happen, they are funny, and then life continues in the same direction it was already heading. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Season 4 episode, Fast Times at Buddy Cianci Junior High. Peter is standing at the top of the staircase in the family home, wearing swim shorts and holding a garden hose. He has connected the hose to a water source, run it down the stairs, and created what he describes to Brian as a water slide. Brian is sitting below with a newspaper, watching this unfold. Peter announces his creation with genuine pride. He has built something inside the house, and the fact that it is inside the house, on stairs, made of water running over carpet and wood, does not register as a problem. He gets on the slide. He goes down the stairs in the manner that stairs punish anyone who goes down them in the wrong way, which is to say, badly and painfully. He reaches the bottom in a condition significantly worse than when he started. He cries out. He is clearly in serious pain. Brian does not call for help. He says, calmly, that calling for help would mean Peter learns nothing. He goes back to his newspaper. Peter remains at the bottom of the stairs, suffering in real time, and the scene ends not with rescue or resolution, but with Brian's assessment hanging in the air, as though it is a reasonable position. The joke is layered. Brian is right that Peter would not learn anything, but Brian is also a dog reading a newspaper while his friend lies injured at the bottom of a homemade staircase water slide, and the show frames his calm as entirely reasonable given the circumstances. Season 6 delivered the most medically consequential of Peter's physical disasters in the episode McStroke, which aired in January 2008. Peter saves the owner of a fast food restaurant called McBurgertown from a fire and is rewarded with a lifetime supply of free burgers. The setup is almost identical to the structure of a fairy tale, where a good deed receives an outsized reward. Peter accepts the reward and immediately begins using it in the way a person with an IQ just below the clinical threshold and no functioning sense of self-preservation might use a lifetime supply of fast food. He sits in the restaurant with Brian and eats 30 hamburgers in a single sitting. Brian tells him to slow down. He points out that Peter has already consumed 30 hamburgers. Peter, mid-chew, dismisses this concern and notes that he cannot feel anything on the left side of his body. He says this the way someone might mention the weather. Brian asks if that sounds good to him. Peter's left eye begins to twitch. He screams. He collapses. The ambulance comes and the hospital confirms what the 30 burgers had already announced. Peter has suffered a massive stroke, leaving half his body paralyzed. The stroke episode is instructive because it shows how the show handles the aftermath of Peter's worst decisions. There is a period where Peter genuinely struggles with the paralysis. He cannot function normally. Daily tasks become difficult. Lois has to care for him in ways that are both exhausting for her and humiliating for him. But rather than build this into anything resembling a lasting consequence, the episode introduces a stem cell research center that restores Peter to full health in what the show presents as approximately 5 minutes of screen time. He walks out completely recovered. He then immediately pivots to pursuing legal action against the burger restaurant, despite the fact that the restaurant did not force him to eat 30 hamburgers. The speed of his recovery is the joke. The show is aware that keeping Peter in a weakened physical state for too long would undercut the premise of every future episode. So it resolves the medical situation almost instantly and moves on. The stroke, one of the most serious medical events a person can experience, becomes a temporary inconvenience between the setup and the punchline. This is the operating logic of Family Guy's physical consequences from the very beginning. The body takes the hit. The body recovers. Peter moves on to the next thing. Eating 30 burgers was not the only time Peter consumed his way into a health crisis. The Season 4 episode Blind Ambition is built around Peter's desire for fame and recognition after Quagmire accidentally saves a woman's life and receives widespread admiration for it. Jealous, Peter decides to earn his own fame by breaking a world record. The record he chooses is for eating the most nickels. This decision passes through no filter. There is no moment of consideration where Peter asks whether ingesting metal coins might be harmful. He begins eating nickels. He eats enough nickels that he develops nickel poisoning. The nickel poisoning causes him to go blind. Blind Ambition is also the episode where Peter first fights Ernie the giant chicken in a full-scale brawl, which emerges in the middle of an unrelated situation and proceeds to wreck significant portions of the surrounding environment before Peter defeats Ernie and returns to what he was doing before, battered and bleeding, as though a prolonged fight with a giant chicken is a minor interruption in the course of a normal afternoon. The connection between the nickel eating and the chicken fight in the same episode captures something essential about how physical comedy works on this show. Peter's body is always doing multiple terrible things at once. The consequences of one bad idea run alongside the chaos of an entirely separate bad idea, and the overlap is presented without comment. Lottery Fever, the Season 10 premiere, contains one of the simplest and most precise physical gags in the show's later run. The Griffins win the Rhode Island lottery, and Peter, newly flush with millions of dollars, decides to recreate a scene from a famous cartoon about a very wealthy duck. He buys a room full of gold coins. He announces that he is going to dive into the coins the way Scrooge McDuck dives into his vault. He does this. He does not float through the coins like a swimmer through water. He hits them the way a person hits a pile of solid metal discs, because that is what gold coins are. And the impact is exactly what physics would predict. He is visibly worse off immediately afterward. The scene is 2 seconds long and requires no explanation. Peter saw a cartoon, believed it was a reliable guide to what diving into coins would feel like, and found out otherwise. What makes Peter's physical comedy work across more than 20 years is that it never becomes rote, even when it is predictable. Viewers familiar with the show know that Peter is going to hurt himself. They know the injury will be disproportionate to the cause. They know the recovery will be faster than medicine would allow, and the lesson will be non-existent. Knowing all of this in advance does not reduce the effect of watching it happen. The construction of each individual gag, the timing, the duration, the choice of what sound Peter makes and for how long, carries the joke, even when the basic premise has been established 100 times before. The staircase has become its own recurring source of material. Over multiple seasons, Peter demonstrates an inability to navigate the stairs in his own home without incident. The Season 14 episode, The Blind Side, devotes significant time to Peter repeatedly falling on newly installed stairs that Lois has put in after a home renovation. He falls. He tries various methods of preventing the fall, including elaborate preparation and physical bracing. He falls anyway. The solutions become increasingly complex, and the results remain identical. He refuses to go down the stairs at all by the end of the episode, which is its own form of adaptation, the logical endpoint of a man who cannot solve a problem and so stops engaging with it. Brian's response to Peter's staircase water slide, that failing to help would be educational, turned out to be empirically wrong. Peter learned nothing from the water slide. He learned nothing from the 30 burgers. He learned nothing from the nickels, the gold coins, the stairs, the chicken fights, or any of the other physical encounters with consequence that the show has staged for him over 2 decades. But this is not a criticism of Brian's theory so much as a demonstration of its limits when applied to Peter Griffin specifically. Some people are not in the business of learning. They are in the business of doing, and then recovering, and then doing again. The knee injury gag from Wasted Talent lives on as the purest distillation of this. Peter falls. Peter hurts his knee. Peter makes the noise for a very long time. And then, eventually, he gets up. He goes to the brewery. He gets thrown out of the brewery. He asks for a Chumbawamba song. He gets kicked in the exact same knee. He makes the noise again. Life in Quahog continues. The body has taken its beating. Another episode begins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter's physical disasters are largely self-contained. He eats the wrong thing, falls down the wrong surface, or picks a fight with the wrong giant bird, and the damage stays personal. The next section covers what happens when his bad ideas scale up past one body and start affecting an entire geopolitical situation. Section 3. Peter Griffin, Nation Builder and Career Criminal. The feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken started over an expired coupon. That is not a simplified version of a more complex origin story. It is the whole story. Ernie gave Peter a coupon at some point before the show's timeline began. The coupon had passed its redemption date. Peter reacted by attacking a giant chicken, and that initial fight has been repeating across more than 20 years of television ever since, each round covering multiple city blocks of property damage and producing an unknown number of bystander casualties who happened to be nearby when the two of them locked eyes again. The chicken's name is Ernie. He is, according to the show's own internal mythology, angry at Peter because of an expired coupon. That is the entire basis of a feud that has played out across more than 20 years of television, derailed dozens of episodes mid-scene, caused incalculable property damage, and resulted in the deaths of an unknown number of bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place when these two decided to resume hostilities. An expired coupon. Peter accepted a promotional coupon from Ernie at some point before the show's timeline, went to use it, discovered it was past its redemption date, and reacted to this minor inconvenience by attacking a chicken. Ernie retaliated. The cycle began. The first full chicken fight aired in the Season 4 episode Blind Ambition, though sources tracing the feud's origin point to a flashback in Da Boom, the Season 2 premiere, as the moment the expired coupon incident is first shown. The show retroactively constructed the mythology around a gag that began as a single absurd interruption and grew into one of the most recognized recurring bits in animated television. Each subsequent fight follows the same basic structure. Ernie appears from nowhere, mid-scene, mid-sentence. Peter notices him. They fight. The fight is long and destructive, and choreographed with genuine effort by the animation team, each encounter escalating in scale beyond the last. Peter eventually wins, always by a narrow and improbable margin. Ernie appears to be dead. Peter leaves. Ernie's eyes open. The second major fight in Blind Ambition parodies the airplane sequence from the first Indiana Jones film. The third, in the Season 5 episode Peter's Got Woods, moves through a construction site. Later fights move through entire city districts, through the sky, through an Inception-style dream-within-a-dream scenario, through underwater environments. The location becomes more elaborate with each round, while the reason for the fight stays exactly as stupid as it always was. That gap between the cause and the consequence is the engine of the joke. Men have started wars over less, the show seems to be saying. But very few wars have been started over less than an expired coupon redeemed in anger by a large Rhode Island man with an IQ below 70. Season 23 brought a significant development to the Ernie storyline when the show dispatched Meg to fight him instead of Peter, in an episode called The Chicken or the Meg. Meg ends up dating Ernie's son, a character named Nugget. The fight that results between Meg and Ernie ended with consequences the show treated as more permanent than usual. Whether the feud between the Griffin family and Ernie's lineage continues in some form remains part of the show's ongoing story, but the original conflict, Peter versus Ernie, stretched from 2000 to the mid-2020s on the basis of a piece of paper nobody remembered to check before printing an expiration date on it. What the chicken fight illustrates about Peter as a character is his total inability to disengage from a conflict once it has started, regardless of how little sense it makes to continue. He does not ask, at any point across more than 20 years of intermittent brawling, whether this is worth it. He does not suggest a conversation. He does not acknowledge that both parties might benefit from stepping back and assessing what is actually being fought over. When Ernie appears, Peter fights Ernie. The simplicity of this response is both the joke and something close to a character thesis. Peter operates on impulse, in real time, without reflection. This is true of his fights and true of his schemes, and nowhere is it more vividly illustrated than in the episode that gave the show one of its most beloved storylines: the founding and rapid collapse of the sovereign nation of Pretoria. Season 2, Episode 18, titled E Peterbus Unum, begins with Peter wanting a swimming pool. This is a reasonable domestic desire. The Griffins do not have a pool, the summer is hot, and Peter would like to have a place to swim that is on his property. He applies for a permit to build one. The permit is denied on zoning grounds, which sends Peter to the mayor's office to complain. While there, and through a chain of bureaucratic investigation that the show renders in the compressed and absurd manner it handles all procedural detail, Peter discovers something remarkable. The Griffin family home is not technically within the city limits of Quahog. Through some combination of historical mapping error and administrative oversight, the house sits in a small pocket of unincorporated land that does not legally belong to any jurisdiction. Peter does not own property in Quahog. He owns property that is not part of anything at all. Most people confronted with this information would consult a lawyer and work toward correcting the clerical error. Peter, whose IQ has already been established as sitting just below the clinical threshold for intellectual disability, reaches a different conclusion. The house is not part of any country, therefore, he can make it a country. He declares his home a sovereign nation. He names it Pretoria because Peterland was already taken by a gay bar, which is the kind of detail the show drops without comment in the middle of what is already an absurdist premise. Peter becomes president, prime minister, king, and entire government of a nation whose territory consists of a single residential property in suburban Rhode Island. The episode moves quickly through the logical consequences of this declaration. Peter prints a flag. He prints currency. He approaches the international community with the expectation of recognition. He demands to be admitted to the United Nations. None of this works because the international community does not recognize micronations established by one man on residential property as a result of a mapping error. But Peter does not accept this as a reason to abandon the project. He presses on. He discovers that as the head of state of a sovereign nation, however unrecognized, he can claim diplomatic immunity. This is where Pretoria becomes genuinely dangerous. Diplomatic immunity for Peter is a blank check. He exercises it during a night out on the town, during which he launches into a full performance of MC Hammer's "You Can't Touch This." The performance functions as a list of things Peter can now do without legal consequence, delivered as an impromptu musical number with choreography. He dances, he sings, he enumerates his new freedoms with visible delight. The song works because it captures exactly how Peter understands power, which is as a personal tool for avoiding accountability rather than as a responsibility toward anyone else. The diplomatic immunity is not going to be used to build diplomatic relationships or advance the interests of Pretoria's citizens, who total one person. It is going to be used to jaywalk and disturb the peace without getting a ticket. The crisis point of the Pretoria storyline arrives when Peter, seeking to expand his nation's territory and thereby earn the respect of the international community, invades Joe Swanson's backyard. Joe is a police officer and Peter's neighbor. He is also paraplegic, which the show regularly uses as a source of both comedy and genuine character depth. Peter annexes Joe's backyard by planting a Praetorian flag in it and declaring it sovereign territory. Joe, understandably, objects to having his yard annexed by the country next door, which is also his neighbor's house. The situation escalates. The United States government becomes involved and imposes economic sanctions on Pretoria, cutting off the Griffin family from all American goods and services. The sanctions are what ends the experiment. Pretoria, as a sovereign nation, cannot import food, fuel, or any of the consumer products the Griffin family depends on. Life inside the house becomes difficult very quickly. Peter holds out for as long as he can, which is not long at all, and eventually concedes. He dissolves Pretoria, cedes the annexation of Joe's backyard, and accepts that the Griffin property is once again part of Quahog, Rhode Island, the United States, and the broader international order he briefly attempted to opt out of. The pool permit is presumably still denied. What is instructive about the Pretoria storyline is the speed of the escalation and the narrowness of Peter's vision throughout. He never once considers what declaring sovereignty would mean for Lois, who lives in the same house and did not sign off on becoming a citizen of a country that does not exist. He never considers what it would mean for the children. He does not think about food supply or utilities or any of the material dependencies that make a house livable. He sees a loophole, he exploits it, and he is surprised when the world responds to his exploitation by making his life worse. This is the template for essentially every Peter scheme across the show's entire run. The list of schemes that follow this same arc across more than 20 seasons is long and varied. Peter's attempts to become famous, to become wealthy, to become powerful, to become respected, all follow the same basic shape. He identifies something he wants, finds the most direct and least considered path toward it, commits to that path with total confidence, and then collides with a wall of consequence he did not see coming because he did not look for it. The wall is always there. The collision is always hard. The recovery is always faster than it should be. In the Season 3 episode, Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, Peter takes a job as a lobbyist for a tobacco company and becomes so good at it that he ends up running the company, at which point he pivots to using his position to make cigarettes safer rather than more addictive, which costs him the job. In the Season 12 episode, Peter Problems, he gets promoted to forklift operator at the brewery, becomes genuinely skilled at the job, and then celebrates by attempting to drink an entire industrial vat of beer, passes out, crashes the forklift into an executive meeting, and is fired. In the Season 4 episode, The Perfect Castaway, he gets lost at sea, is presumed dead, and returns to find Lois engaged to Brian, at which point he handles the situation by challenging Brian to a physical contest for Lois's hand, rather than simply explaining that he is alive and would like his wife back. Each of these stories is distinct in its particulars, but identical in its structure. Peter moves fast, thinks slow, and leaves a trail of collateral damage that the episode spends its remaining time cleaning up. The schemes rarely harm only Peter. Lois is the most frequent secondary casualty, absorbing the financial, social, and occasionally physical consequences of her husband's latest venture. The children are regularly caught in the crossfire. The neighbors, particularly Joe and Quagmire, are recruited into situations they did not ask to be part of. Even Brian, who is in many ways the most self-aware character in the house, regularly finds himself pulled into Peter's orbit and deposited in circumstances that Brian would never have chosen independently. The chicken fights sit slightly apart from the schemes because they are not really planned. They just happen. Ernie appears, the fight happens, Peter leaves. But they share with the schemes the quality of absolute disproportionality. The response to the situation is always far larger than the situation warrants. An expired coupon becomes a years-long feud. A mapping error becomes a nation. A lifetime supply of burgers becomes a stroke. A desire for a pool becomes an international incident. Peter does not have a volume dial. Everything goes to 10 immediately and stays there until the episode ends. The writers understood early that this quality, the absolute refusal to respond to any situation at a reasonable scale, was both the character's funniest trait and the structural engine that allowed the show to take any starting premise and expand it into a full episode. Give Peter a minor inconvenience, and he will turn it into a catastrophe. Give him an opportunity, and he will abuse it until it collapses. Give him a coupon, and he will fight a giant chicken for 2 decades. Diplomatic immunity lasts 1 episode. Pretoria lasts 1 episode. The chicken feud lasted more than 20 years. The difference is that Ernie kept coming back, and Peter kept fighting him, and neither one of them ever stopped to ask what they were still arguing about. That kind of commitment to a bad idea, sustained across decades without reflection or resolution, is, in its own way, one of the most purely Peter Griffin things the show ever produced. The pool, for what it is worth, never got built. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter's schemes tend to collapse under their own weight, usually within a single episode. The next section looks at what happens when the person everyone assumes is holding the family together starts making decisions just as bad as his, and sometimes worse. Section 4. Lois Griffin and the limits of being the reasonable one. Lois Griffin stole a ham. She was a few dollars short at the grocery store, decided not to put anything back, and walked out with a ham she had not paid for hidden in her purse. This single act, small and impulsive and driven by nothing more than not wanting the hassle of returning something to a shelf, set off a chain of events that ended with the family fleeing Rhode Island as fugitives in a laundry van, hiding in a part of Quahog the show calls Asian Town, and Meg driving a rickshaw for income while her mother's prison sentence waited to be resolved. This framing holds up for approximately 3 seasons before it starts showing serious cracks. By season 4, Lois Griffin has revealed herself to be something considerably more complicated than the patient, sensible mother the early episodes established. She steals things. She lies. She makes decisions of breathtaking recklessness, and then defends them with the self-assurance of someone who still believes she is the reasonable one in the room. She is not always wrong about that. The bar in the Griffin household is set extremely low, and Lois clears it most of the time. But clearing a low bar does not make a person stable, and across more than 20 seasons, Lois has demonstrated a capacity for spectacular personal collapse that rivals anything her husband has managed. The episode that crystallizes this most cleanly is Breaking Out is Hard to Do, Season 4, Episode 9, which aired in July 2005. The setup is mundane. Lois is doing the grocery shopping and finds herself a few dollars short at the checkout. She cannot pay for everything in her cart. Rather than put something back, she takes a ham from the meat department, pretends to be returning it, and hides it in her purse instead. She steals a ham. This is where the episode begins, at the level of a minor, relatable, forgivable act of desperation. A few dollars short, a hungry family at home. One ham quietly transferred from the store's inventory to her personal bag. The rush she gets from it is the problem. Lois does not feel guilty after stealing the ham. She feels alive. The transgression triggers something in her that the rest of her daily life does not. Some chemical response to rule breaking that her routine as a stay-at-home mother and household manager has thoroughly starved. She goes back. She steals clothes. She steals more food. She escalates through consumer goods and into territory that stops being explainable by financial necessity. She steals a Matisse painting. A painting from a gallery or display setting, lifted without hesitation by a woman who, 20 minutes of screen time ago, was worried about the grocery bill. Brian is the one who ultimately confronts her. He points out, with the careful reasoning of a dog who understands human moral frameworks better than most of the humans around him, that what she is doing is wrong and has consequences. Lois accepts this. She agrees to stop and return what she has taken. She is in the process of doing exactly that when Joe Swanson, who is both the family's neighbor and a police officer, arrests her before she can complete the return. She is charged and sentenced to 3 years in prison. What happens next is the episode's real argument about the Griffin family as a unit. Without Lois, the house collapses almost immediately. Peter and the children cannot maintain basic domestic function. The home deteriorates into a state of genuine squalor within a short period of time. When Peter visits Lois in prison and sees how badly things have fallen apart, he does not decide to manage better. He does not hire help or establish a routine. He decides to break her out. This is Peter's solution to the problem of his wife's incarceration, a prison break, executed by a man whose IQ the state of Rhode Island has formally assessed as falling below the clinical threshold for standard cognitive function. The break works, improbably, and the family flees in a laundry van. They end up in a part of town the show calls Asian Town, where they rent a cramped apartment and attempt to build new lives as fugitives from the justice system of Rhode Island. Meg becomes a rickshaw driver. Chris works as a portrait artist. Stewie gets a job sewing shoes in what the show describes as a sweatshop, gets fired after sewing a shoe to his own hand, and is replaced by a newborn baby. Peter attempts a career as a sumo wrestler, which does not go well. Joe tracks them down, pursues them through the streets in a rickshaw chase, commandeers a police helicopter, and at one point finds himself being followed by TIE fighters in a sequence the show offers without explanation. Lois eventually decides to stop running. She surrenders herself to face the consequences of the original theft, which at this point feels almost quaint given everything that has happened since. Joe, in a moment of gratitude after Lois saves him from falling off a ledge during the pursuit, gets her sentence canceled. Life returns to normal. The Matisse presumably ended up back on a wall somewhere. The ham was long gone. Breaking out is hard to do, matters, because it reveals the version of Lois that the show returns to repeatedly in later seasons. A woman whose grip on conventional behavior is more conditional than her self-presentation suggests. The kleptomania that drives the episode is not a random character quirk introduced for a single story. It reflects something genuine about Lois, a restlessness underneath the responsible surface, a hunger for experience that her domestic life does not satisfy. She married Peter Griffin. She manages his disasters on a daily basis. She raises 3 children whose collective intellectual resources are strained by basic tasks. The rush of stealing a ham is, in context, the most stimulation she has had in years. This undercurrent runs through many of Lois's most chaotic moments. In a much later episode, she becomes obsessed with winning the Customer of the Week award at a local coffee shop. The award is minor, the kind of recognition that matters only in the immediate social ecosystem of the shop's regulars. Lois wants it anyway. She campaigns for it through repeated visits and carefully managed behavior. When weeks pass and other customers keep winning, she manufactures a crisis. She stages a severe allergic reaction affecting one of the baristas, positioning herself as the hero who responds in the moment of need. The plan goes badly. People who witness it need to be managed. Lois's solution to managing them is to kidnap them, which is not a small crime by any standard. She ends up in jail again. When she gets out, the show indicates she has not processed the experience in any way that would prevent the same sequence of events from happening again. The coffee shop storyline is a sharper version of something the show had been building in Lois for years. The way that small frustrations, when accumulated in a person who believes herself to be fundamentally reasonable and correct, can produce completely disproportionate responses. Lois does not steal paintings or kidnap witnesses because she is a bad person. She does these things because she has convinced herself that her motivations are justified, that wanting the Customer of the Week award badly enough transforms the methods used to get it into something defensible. This is a form of self-deception the show explores in Lois more than in any other character, because Lois is the only one who maintains a consistent narrative about being the responsible adult in the room. Peter does not have a flattering self-narrative to undercut. He genuinely believes he is doing a reasonable job most of the time, but this belief is itself so obviously disconnected from reality that it functions as part of his comedy rather than as irony. Lois is different. She has constructed an identity around being the capable one, and the moments where the show peels that back are funnier and darker than anything Peter does because they require the demolition of something she genuinely believes about herself. Her capacity for sudden and extreme anger is another version of this. Multiple episodes show Lois escalating from composed to physically threatening in a very short period of time. She has attacked Peter for coming home with the wrong groceries. She has beaten people in contexts where beating them was not warranted. She has, in moments of genuine fury, demonstrated a physical aggression that sits completely at odds with the calm maternal figure she presents during calmer stretches of the show. The show treats this as both funny and revealing. The calm is real. The anger is also real. Both of them live in the same person, and neither one cancels the other out. Her birthday episode, in which Peter attempts to say kind things about Lois as she struggles with growing older, is a gentler example of how badly her baseline stability can erode under the right pressure. Peter, trying to be supportive, manages to age-shame her instead. His comments, delivered without malice, land as a series of reminders that she is getting older, and that getting older is not good. Lois's response is to regress, behaviorally and emotionally, into something that resembles teenage rebellion more than adult processing of a difficult feeling. She sneaks into a concert. She attempts to seduce a pop star. Peter has to intervene. The whole situation is driven not by Peter's cruelty, but by his incompetence, which in some ways makes it worse. He was trying to help and made everything worse. And Lois's reaction, while understandable in its emotional logic, is still a grown woman behaving in ways that require her husband to physically remove her from a public venue. What the birthday episode shares with the ham theft and the Customer of the Week kidnapping is a structure where Lois's internal experience of herself as deserving something comes into conflict with reality's failure to deliver it. She deserves to feel good about her birthday. She deserves the Customer of the Week award. She deserved a few dollars more at the grocery store. In each case, the gap between what she feels entitled to and what she actually receives produces behavior that escalates far past what the situation called for. Stewie once observed that Lois has a temper that she manages carefully, and that the management is the only thing standing between the family and genuine chaos. The episodes where the management slips suggest this assessment is accurate. Peter is usually the gravitational center of the Griffin family's worst moments. The show builds its structure around his decisions and their consequences, but the most interesting episodes are often the ones where Lois steps out from behind that structure and reveals that the stability she provides is a managed performance rather than a natural state. She holds things together not because holding things together is easy for her, but because she has decided it is her job, and she commits to that job with the same intensity she brings to everything else. When she stops committing, or when the pressure exceeds what her commitment can contain, the results are not mild. She does not have small breakdowns. She steals paintings and kidnaps witnesses and flees across Rhode Island in a laundry van. The Asian town sequence in Breaking Out is Hard to Do is the clearest image the show has produced of what the Griffin family looks like when Lois is removed from the equation and then reintroduced under pressure. Without her, the house cannot function. Peter's response to her absence is to make it worse. Her response to being on the run is to eventually accept accountability, which is more than Peter would have done in the same position, and which is what ultimately resolves the crisis. She is better at consequence management than her husband. She is also more capable of the initial act that created the consequences, because she can execute it with more sophistication and less visible chaos. Peter eats 30 burgers and has a stroke in public. Lois steals a Matisse and hides it until Brian makes her feel bad about it. The show has always been slightly more careful with Lois than with the other characters. Not in terms of shielding her from bad decisions, but in terms of giving those decisions a psychological context that makes them feel rooted in something. Peter does stupid things because he lacks the cognitive and emotional machinery to do otherwise. Lois does stupid things because she is a complicated person under sustained pressure who sometimes hits a limit and crosses a line she had been carefully not crossing for a long time. The line is always there. The crossing is always in character. It just looks surprising because the performance of reasonableness that precedes it is so convincing. She told Peter to put the ham back. She told him this before she stole it herself. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. Because she was $3 short and the family was hungry and she was tired and she wanted to. That combination, knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway because the feeling of doing it is more compelling than the knowledge of its wrongness, is not what the family expects from Lois Griffin. It is also not surprising once the show has spent enough seasons pulling back the curtain on who she actually is underneath the role she plays in the household. The ham was just a ham, but it opened a door that the show has walked through many times since, into a version of Lois that is less anchor and more participant, less the stable force holding the chaos at bay, and more one of the forces contributing to it. The family needs her to be the reasonable one. She needs that too. When she manages it, the household has a center. When she does not, the family ends up in a laundry van somewhere in Asian town, and Meg is driving a rickshaw, and Stewie has sewn a shoe to his hand, and Peter is failing at sumo. And somewhere behind all of that is a Matisse painting and a grocery store ham that started the whole thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Lois's worst moments involve a person who knows better choosing not to be better and paying for it in ways that drag the whole family down with her. The next section moves to a Griffin who has almost no idea what better looks like to begin with and finds himself consistently confused by a world that makes perfect sense to everyone else. Section 5. Chris Griffin and the world he cannot quite figure out. Sitting at the dinner table one evening, Chris Griffin decides to set up a cutaway gag. This is a very specific thing to attempt in the world of Family Guy, where cutaway gags are the show's most reliable structural tool, and where the characters occasionally demonstrate an awareness that they live inside a television program with particular comedic conventions. Chris has watched enough of his own life to understand that when someone at the dinner table says something like, "That reminds me of the time," the scene cuts away to an unrelated memory or hypothetical that is funnier than whatever was happening at the table. He sets it up. He announces the transition. He names the situation that is supposedly even crazier than this one. The cutaway happens. It shows Chris at a different dinner table, where he tells a woman named Mrs. Sullivan that her macaroni and cheese is delicious. That is the entire cutaway. No punchline, no absurdist escalation, no joke at the end of the journey. Chris has used the show's primary comedic mechanism to deliver a polite compliment about a casserole dish. Peter, who is himself a man with a documented IQ below the clinical threshold for standard cognitive function, looks at his son with visible disappointment and tells him he is not ready for flashbacks. Chris hangs his head. He knows Peter is right, which might be the most humiliating part of the whole thing. Being told by Peter Griffin that a comedy attempt was not up to standard is the kind of feedback that should produce genuine self-reflection, because Peter's bar for comedy is not high, and clearing it should be straightforward. Chris Griffin is the middle child of the Griffin family, voiced by Seth Green across the show's entire run, and he occupies a specific comedic lane that is distinct from Peter's. Peter is dumb in ways that are loud and consequential. His mistakes affect other people. His decisions produce national incidents and medical emergencies and property damage across multiple city blocks. Chris's stupidity is quieter and more personal. He is confused by the world at a foundational level, not in the way someone who has been given bad information is confused, but in the way someone who has simply never fully connected with how basic things work is confused. He wrestles lamps. He does not know his own name. He finds the cutaway format beyond his technical reach. The lamp incident comes from the Season 3 finale, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it is the episode's most efficient demonstration of what Chris is working with cognitively. Peter, wanting to show someone how gullible his son is, smacks Chris on the back from behind. He then tells Chris that the lamp did it. Chris turns to look at the lamp, a stationary household object that has not moved, cannot move, and has no mechanisms for striking a person. He decides the lamp is responsible. He tackles it. He wrestles with it on the floor of the living room with full commitment, treating this inanimate object as an aggressor that needs to be subdued. Peter watches this unfold with a look that is somewhere between pride at being right and unease at the magnitude of what he has just demonstrated. The scene is short, and it does not dwell on its own implications, which is part of why it lands so cleanly. Chris's willingness to fight a lamp is not presented as a shocking revelation about his character. It is presented as confirmation of something Peter already knew well enough to demonstrate on demand. The son is not skeptical of his father's claim. He does not ask how a lamp could have reached him. He does not look at the lamp and note that it has no arms. The information that the lamp hit him is received and acted upon immediately, with full physical engagement. What separates Chris from Peter in terms of comedic function is that Chris's confusion tends to be passive rather than active. Peter reaches incorrect conclusions and then does enormous things based on them. He builds nations, starts feuds, hospitalizes people, and eats industrial quantities of food. Chris reaches incorrect conclusions and then sits with them, accepting the confusion as the natural state of things, without necessarily doing anything dramatic in response. He is not a force of chaos the way Peter is. He is more like a gentle disruption, a person around whom things occasionally go wrong in small ways because he is operating on information that does not quite match the world he is operating in. The episode that pushes this furthest is a much later one, The Most Interesting Man in the World, from Season 12. Peter begins taking business trips and comes back from them changed, more refined and worldly in his manner, using language and references that do not fit the Peter Griffin the family is used to living with. He replaces the living room television with a bookshelf. The family adjusts to this new Peter awkwardly. Chris, watching all of this, is more confused than anyone. When Peter returns from one of his trips and Chris asks how it went, the conversation lands on the word Chris, as in the name Peter uses to address his own son. And Chris indicates that he does not recognize this word as applying to him. He does not know that Chris is his name. Stewie, witnessing this exchange, reacts with the kind of stunned silence that even a character who has built time machines and plotted acts of global domination cannot quite process. Stewie has encountered a level of not knowing that sits outside his models for human cognition. Chris has presumably been called Chris for his entire life. The name appears on his school records, on any official documentation connected to him, in every conversation anyone has ever had with him directly. And yet the word, in this moment, registers as unfamiliar. Not forgotten, exactly, just not landed. Chris has been called Chris for over a decade of his life, inside and outside the show's timeline, and has not fully internalized that this is what he is called. His artistic ability exists in genuine tension with everything else about him. Chris can draw, not in a casual or incidental way, but with real skill, producing portraits and illustrations that are genuinely good. The Season 3 episode, A Picture's Worth $1,000, tracks this ability seriously, following Chris to New York City after his artwork catches the attention of a gallery owner. The path toward genuine artistic recognition is available to him. All he has to do is cut off contact with his family, which the gallery owner presents as a prerequisite for serious artistic development. The idea being that a person cannot achieve greatness while remaining attached to the domestic mediocrity of their origins. Chris cannot do it, not because he considers the trade-off and decides family matters more than ambition, though that would be a reasonable and even admirable choice. He cannot do it because the idea of operating independently of his family, of navigating the art world and New York City on his own terms without the people he knows around him, is simply beyond what his cognitive and emotional resources can support. He goes home. The gallery opportunity ends. The artistic talent remains unused at a high level, deployed instead in the ordinary context of a suburban teenager's life in Quahog. This is the particular sadness underneath the comedy of Chris Griffin, and the show touches it only lightly, aware that dwelling on it too long would shift the tone of his scenes into territory that does not serve the kind of show Family Guy is. Chris has a genuinely useful ability, one that could take him somewhere, and lacks almost everything else that would be required to do anything with it. He cannot set up a cutaway gag. He wrestled a lamp. He does not know his name. But he can draw a portrait that makes a New York gallery owner want to represent him. The gap between what he has and what he can do with it is wide enough to look at directly for only a moment before the show moves on to the next joke. His confusion about languages surfaces in a Season 8 episode where the show reveals that Chris cannot distinguish between Korean and Spanish. These are languages from entirely different language families, spoken on different continents, with no phonetic or structural overlap that would make them easy to confuse for someone paying any attention at all. Chris has apparently not been paying attention. The confusion is not treated as a joke about languages specifically, but as a data point about how Chris experiences the world, which is as a place full of categories that do not quite stick. Camping episodes tend to expose Chris in particular ways because they remove him from the domestic environment where his confusion can be managed and place him in a setting that requires practical reasoning, navigation, and basic outdoor competence. A Season 6 father and son camping trip with Peter, Joe, and Cleveland and their respective sons gives the show room to contrast Chris with the other children, most of whom are managing better than he is. Chris's approach to the outdoors is not hostile or afraid. He simply has no reliable method for interacting with it. He proceeds through the camping trip on instinct, and his instincts are wrong in the patient, undramatic way that his instincts are usually wrong. The Titanic episode, in which Stewie uses his time machine to take the family back in time to the voyage of the Titanic, puts Chris in a historical situation that he also cannot fully process. He boards the ship with the same mild confusion he brings to every situation, makes decisions that do not account for the information the audience has about where this ship is headed, and moves through the story in a way that suggests the past is not fundamentally different to him from the present, which is to say, both are places where things happen that Chris does not fully understand. His relationship with the evil monkey is one of the show's longer-running background gags, and it is worth examining for what it reveals about Chris as a character. For multiple seasons, Chris insists that there is an evil monkey living in his closet, pointing at him menacingly. No one believes him. His parents and siblings treat this claim as a product of childhood imagination or anxiety, the kind of thing a kid might invent to explain bad feelings or disturbed sleep. The joke is that the monkey is real. It genuinely lives in his closet. Chris is right about the monkey. The gag resolves eventually when the monkey moves on to Jake Tucker's closet, and Chris and the monkey part on something approaching friendly terms. But what the monkey storyline does over the years it runs is place Chris in the unusual position of being correct about something that everyone around him dismisses. He knows about the monkey. The monkey is there. His family's refusal to take the monkey seriously does not make the monkey go away. In a show full of characters whose perceptions of reality are regularly shown to be wrong, Chris's perception of the monkey is one of the few things he gets right, and nobody notices. The cutaway at Mrs. Sullivan's table is the sharpest version of something the show returns to often with Chris, which is the moment where the gap between intention and execution is so wide that the intention cannot even be clearly identified anymore. He wanted to set up a joke. He understood the format well enough to attempt it. What came out was a compliment about pasta. Between the plan and the result, something was lost that cannot be entirely accounted for, and the result is a cutaway that functions as its own joke, precisely because it does not function as one. Peter tells him he is not ready for flashbacks. Chris accepts this assessment and hangs his head. In the Griffin family, being told by Peter Griffin that something was not smart is about as low as feedback can go, and Chris receives it with the quiet acceptance of someone who has been receiving similar feedback for long enough that it no longer surprises him. He will try again. The next attempt will probably produce something equally baffling. He does not have a mechanism for converting this kind of feedback into adjusted performance, any more than Peter has a mechanism for converting consequences into changed behavior. The lamp is still in the living room. It has never hit anyone. Chris remains prepared to fight it again if his father tells him it did. What makes Chris work as a character over such a long run is that his particular form of not understanding the world is gentle enough to be watchable without becoming depressing. Peter's stupidity produces explosions. Lois's instability produces crime waves and custody battles. Chris's version produces wrestling matches with furniture and dinner table compliments that go nowhere. The scale is smaller. The consequences are contained. He moves through the world without doing much damage to anyone outside his immediate vicinity, which, in the Griffin family, is a kind of achievement. The drawing is still good. Nobody is arguing about that. The portrait of Mrs. Sullivan would probably have been excellent, and somewhere in a New York gallery that never signed him, a wall remains empty that Chris Griffin could have filled. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Chris's confusion is something he mostly keeps to himself, producing damage that stays small and personal. The next section covers the Griffin family member whose entire existence the show has framed as a punchline, and what happens when that punchline occasionally talks back. Section 6. Meg Griffin and the Art of Being Overlooked. Peter Griffin once told everyone that Meg had died. She had not died. She was alive and present and living in the same house she had always lived in, going about her life in the way she always did, which is to say quietly and without much acknowledgement from the people around her. Peter did not announce her death out of grief or confusion. He announced it because he did not want to spend time with her and found the fiction of her death more convenient than the reality of her presence. Nobody questioned it with much urgency. Nobody pushed back with the kind of energy a person pushes back with when they believe something is genuinely wrong. Life in the Griffin household adjusted around the absence of Meg Griffin the way water adjusts around a stone someone has removed from a stream, smoothly and without lasting evidence that the stone was ever there. This is the operating condition of Meg's life across more than 20 seasons of Family Guy. She is the oldest child of the Griffin family, born Megatron Griffin, a fact the show treats as a piece of trivia so buried that dedicated fans hold it as a coveted piece of insider knowledge, while casual viewers never encounter it at all. She is voiced by Mila Kunis, who took over the role from Lacey Chabert after the first season, and whose real-world status as one of Hollywood's most recognized and conventionally attractive performers sits in direct and deliberate irony against the show's relentless insistence that Meg is ugly, unwanted, and essentially invisible to the world around her. The joke has been running since 1999. It has not always been funny. It has not always been mean. It has sometimes been both at once, which is the most uncomfortable version. The family's treatment of Meg follows a consistent logic that the show established early and has reinforced across every subsequent season. She is the person everyone's frustration lands on when it needs somewhere to go. Peter's irritation finds her first. Lois's patience fins fastest in her direction. Chris ignores her because he does not register her strongly enough to actively ignore her, which is its own particular form of dismissal. Stewie's relationship to Meg is complex in ways that shift depending on the episode, but his default mode in early seasons was contempt. A contempt expressed with the particular fluency he brings to all his hostilities. Brian treats her with something closer to mild tolerance, which by Griffin family standards makes him her most consistent ally. The Christmas episode that gave Meg an empty box is the image most often cited when people want a single frame that captures what the show is doing with this character. The family opens gifts. The moment is constructed with the warm visual language of holiday television, the tree in the background, the family together, the ritual of giving and receiving. Meg opens hers. The box contains nothing. No explanation is offered. Nobody apologizes. Nobody notices that this is strange. The box is empty, and the camera registers that it is empty. And then the scene moves on. Because in the Griffin household, Meg receiving an empty box at Christmas is not an event that requires comment or correction. What the show is doing with this recurring structure is using Meg as a pressure valve. The theory, articulated by Seth MacFarlane in various interviews over the years, is that Meg absorbs the family's collective cruelty so that the cruelty does not have to be directed outward at the audience. She is the designated target, the character whose function is to receive the worst of what the Griffins are capable of and neutralize it by containing it. This makes structural sense for a show that wants to explore a deeply dysfunctional family without making the audience feel that they are watching something simply unpleasant. Meg takes the hit, the show moves on. The balance is maintained. Whether this works as a comedy strategy or crosses into something more uncomfortable depends on the episode and the specific form the mistreatment takes. Most of the time, it functions. "Shut up, Meg." Peter's reflexive dismissal of anything Meg says or starts to say has entered the cultural vocabulary as a catchphrase precisely because it is so well-timed and so consistent. It lands every time, not because silencing a teenager is funny in itself, but because of the absolute automaticity of it, the way Peter deploys it without thought, without processing what Meg has actually said, as a kind of verbal reflex that bypasses engagement entirely. The joke is in the speed, the complete absence of consideration, the fact that the phrase is ready before Meg has finished speaking. Meg's own worst decisions are worth examining separately from what the family does to her, because the show has always given her moments of agency that she uses with varying degrees of wisdom. She is not purely a passive recipient of other people's behavior. She makes choices, some of them genuinely baffling, some of them understandable given the context of a life lived under sustained dismissal, and some of them that produce consequences the show then uses to justify further dismissal, which is its own uncomfortable loop. The Joe Swanson obsession is one of the clearest examples of Meg pursuing something she wants in a way that makes the situation significantly worse. Joe is the family's neighbor, a police officer, and married to Bonnie. Meg develops an intense fixation on him. In one episode, she takes over caregiving responsibilities for Joe and his infant daughter Susie in Bonnie's absence, and uses the access this provides to attempt to insert herself into his life as a replacement for his wife. She does not approach this ambition subtly. She moves through the Swanson household as though establishing residence, rearranging the emotional architecture of Joe's domestic life while he attempts to maintain appropriate boundaries with his friend's teenage daughter. The episode ends without Meg achieving what she wants, which is the standard outcome for Meg's ambitions. But the pursuit itself reveals something specific about how she processes the gap between what she wants and what is available to her. She does not want small things. She does not pursue modest goals that fit the scale of her social position. She wants the same things other people want: recognition, affection, a sense that she matters to someone. And she pursues them with an intensity that the people around her find alarming, precisely because they have decided, before she has done anything, that she is not the kind of person who should want things that much. The intensity reads as desperation. The desperation reads as pathetic. The cycle reinforces itself. Barely Legal, the Season 5 episode built around Meg's feelings for Brian, follows a similar structure. Meg asks Brian to accompany her to a school event after she is rejected by the boy she wanted to go with. Brian agrees out of sympathy, and the evening is more pleasant than either of them expected. Meg interprets this as evidence of a mutual connection that does not exist in the way she believes it does. She develops a serious attachment. She pursues it past the point where Brian's polite attempts to redirect her can contain it. She kidnaps him. She holds him in her room and expresses her feelings for him in a way that the show plays as comedy, but that carries real information about how completely Meg's social isolation has distorted her sense of what appropriate connection looks like. Brian eventually escapes. life returns to its default configuration. But the barely legal episode is one of the places where the show is most honest about what years of systematic rejection do to a person's capacity to read social situations accurately. Meg does not kidnap Brian because she is a bad person. She does it because she has developed almost no framework for understanding when someone is being kind out of obligation versus when someone is genuinely interested in her company. Because the occasions when someone has been genuinely interested in her company are so rare that she cannot calibrate against them. The isolation has produced a reading problem. The reading problem produces escalation. The escalation produces exactly the kind of outcome that confirms the original dismissal. Seahorse Seashell Party, the Season 10 episode that aired as part of a crossover hurricane storyline, is the episode most often cited when people argue about whether the show's treatment of Meg has a point or is simply cruel for its own sake. The family is trapped inside during the hurricane, television unavailable, the usual distractions gone. Meg, without the buffer of Peter going somewhere else and Chris retreating to his room and everyone dispersing into their separate corners, reaches her limit. She confronts the family about how they treat her. She names the behavior, describes its effects, explains what it has cost her to absorb it for as long as she has. The confrontation is written with unusual directness. The family does not respond well initially. The episode has real tension. Then something happens that critics found either clever or deeply frustrating, depending on how they read it. Meg concludes the episode by accepting the role the family needs her to fill. She decides, explicitly, to continue absorbing the family's dysfunction because, without a designated target, the cruelty would find somewhere else to go, somewhere that might cause more damage. She makes herself the martyr deliberately, with full knowledge of what she is choosing. The episode frames this as a form of strength, a conscious sacrifice rather than a passive victimhood. Meg is not being crushed. She is choosing to hold the weight. Reviewers were divided. Some found the resolution genuinely moving, a reimagining of Meg's position as agency rather than suffering. Others found it a convenient way for the show to continue the same treatment without the discomfort of having been called out for it. Both readings are honest responses to what the episode actually does, and the fact that both readings are available simultaneously is either a mark of the writing's complexity or its evasiveness, possibly both at once. Meg has had moments across the show's run where the dismissal reverses, where she is briefly recognized, briefly powerful, briefly in a position that the family cannot ignore. Dial Meg for Murder, the Season 8 episode in which she returns from a prison stint tougher and more intimidating than anyone in the household expected, treats her transformation seriously for the length of the episode. She commands respect. She moves through the house with an authority that the family responds to with something close to fear. Peter, who has spent years reflexively silencing her, is visibly cautious around this new version of his daughter. The episode does not maintain the change. By the end, the balance returns to its prior configuration. But Dial Meg for Murder is valuable as proof that the show knew what a version of Meg with power looked like. It chose to visit that version briefly and then leave it behind. Her athletic ability surfaces in a similar way. Meg has, in various episodes, demonstrated sporting capability that the family does not credit and that the show gives her and then removes before it can become something that reshapes her position in the household. She runs well. She is physically capable in ways that do not fit the narrative the family has built around her. These capabilities appear and disappear without integration into a sustained arc, because a sustained arc for Meg would require the show to do something it has mostly declined to do, which is to change the fundamental dynamic she occupies. The full name, Megatron, is a detail that rewards the attention paid to it. Megatron is the primary villain of the Transformers franchise, a character defined by power, destructive capability, and absolute refusal to be diminished by the forces around him. The gap between the name and the character who carries it is either accidental or the most concentrated irony the show has ever produced about Meg. A name built for dominance, attached to a person the show has designated as the recipient of everyone else's worst behavior. She has a villain's name and a scapegoat's life. And the distance between those two things is where most of her comedy and most of her sadness live. What the show has never quite resolved about Meg is what it wants the audience to feel about her. Laughter at her expense is the default and the easiest response, because the show sets up the jokes in that direction and the timing supports them. But underneath the jokes, there is enough genuine pathos built into the character's situation that some viewers find the laughter difficult to sustain without some discomfort attaching to it. The empty Christmas box is funny for about a second, and then it sits there in the mind as an image of something that is also just straightforwardly unkind. The gap between the laugh and the discomfort is where Meg Griffin lives. She made some genuinely bad decisions of her own across the run. She has pursued people and situations in ways that produced the opposite of what she wanted. She has misjudged social contexts badly enough to end up in positions that confirmed the worst things the family believed about her. She has sometimes been her own worst enemy, in the specific sense of taking actions that gave the people around her material to work with. But the decisions exist in the context of a life that has given her very little to calibrate against. Very few examples of what healthy connection looks like, and almost no reliable feedback that the version of herself she presents to the world is worth presenting. Megatron Griffin, daughter of Peter and Lois, sister to Chris and Stewie, voiced by one of Hollywood's most recognizable performers, given a villain's name and a sad kid's life, has been on television since 1999. She has been dismissed and dismissed again, and has occasionally pushed back, and has occasionally been briefly powerful, and has mostly returned to the position the show assigned her before any of that happened. She absorbs the family's worst impulses, so the family can keep functioning. She does this now with what the show frames as conscious choice rather than helpless default, which is either a promotion or a different kind of the same thing, depending on which way the light is hitting it. The box was empty. She opened it anyway, because it was Christmas and it was her box, and opening it was the thing to do. That is Meg Griffin in a single image. The expectation persisting despite the evidence, the participation continuing despite the returns, the presence maintained in a household that keeps announcing, in small ways and large ones, that her presence is optional. She is still there. She has always been still there. That, in its own way, is the most specifically Meg thing about her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg's position in the family is defined by how little space she is given and how she navigates that limitation. The next section covers the Griffin, who takes up the most space, intellectually and literally, while consistently failing to justify the amount of room he claims. Brian Griffin, the dog who believes he is the smartest person in any room he enters. Section 7. Brian Griffin and the performance of being smart. At some point in Season 12, Peter Griffin comes home from a business trip, having developed an interest in reading. He has been spending time away from Quahog in environments that exposed him to books, ideas, and people who discuss them. And something has caught. He starts reading. He replaces the living room television with a bookshelf. He uses vocabulary that does not usually come out of Peter Griffin's mouth. The household adjusts to this version of Peter with the discomfort of people who have built their routines around a very different person and now have to account for a new one. Brian watches all of this and does what Brian always does when someone around him demonstrates intellectual engagement. He performs alongside it. He signals his own reading life, his own relationship to literature, his own participation in the world of ideas that Peter has apparently just discovered. He presents himself as someone for whom this territory is already familiar, already inhabited, already home. He is the dog who reads. He is the writer. He is the one in this house who has always engaged with books seriously and does not need a business trip to discover them. Peter, newly interested in exactly this subject, asks Brian what he has read lately. Brian's answer is a cascade of ums and ahs and partial sentences that do not resolve into titles. He cannot produce a single book he has recently read because Brian Griffin, the character the show has spent years establishing as the intellectual of the Griffin family, the cultured voice amid the chaos, the dog with the novel in progress and the martini in hand, and the pointed observations about the state of American culture, does not actually read. He presents as a reader. He performs the identity of a reader. The books on the shelf, the writing ambitions, the literary references dropped into conversation. These are props in a self-presentation that has very little material underneath it. Peter, a man with a formally documented IQ below the clinical threshold for intellectual disability, has caught Brian Griffin in an intellectual fraud. This is the moment the show makes explicit what it had been implying for several seasons. Brian's intelligence is substantially a construction. He is not stupid exactly. His vocabulary is broader than Peter's, and his social awareness is sharper. And he can hold a conversation about ideas in a way that Peter genuinely cannot. But the gap between how Brian presents himself and what Brian actually is has been widening since the middle of the show's run, and by season 12, it has become wide enough to fall through. The novel is the most sustained version of this gap. Brian has been writing a novel for years. The novel is referenced across multiple seasons as the serious work that justifies his self-image as an artist and intellectual, the thing that separates him from the people around him who are not doing anything meaningful with their lives. The novel's existence is important to Brian. It represents who he is beyond the domestic role of family pet, beyond the failed relationships and the drinking, and the occasional lapse into behavior that is difficult to distinguish from the less flattering instincts of an ordinary dog. He is a writer. The novel proves it. When the novel is eventually published, it sells almost nothing. The reviews are not kind. The book does not connect with readers in the way Brian's belief in it suggested it would. He takes this badly, which is understandable. But his response to the failure is not to examine the work or consider whether the critical assessment might contain useful information. His response is to defend the novel's quality against a market that did not understand it, to position the failure as a failure of the audience rather than a failure of execution. This is a particular form of self-protection that requires maintaining the belief in one's own genius more firmly the more aggressively it is challenged by external evidence. The quagmire confrontation from the Season 8 episode, Jerome is the New Black, is the sharpest external voice the show ever aimed at Brian. Quagmire, for most of the show's run, occupies a specific lane. He is the unashamed one, the character who does not dress up his behavior in philosophical clothing or literary pretension. He wants what he wants, and he pursues it without apology. This makes him, in certain respects, the least hypocritical person in Peter's social circle, because he has never claimed to be better than what he is. When Brian asks Quagmire directly why Quagmire dislikes him so much, the answer comes out as a minute and a half of detailed, specific, and structurally coherent criticism. Quagmire does not attack Brian randomly. He goes through the catalog. He notes that Brian constantly pursues his best friend's wife, a woman whose husband provides Brian's food and housing and essentially his entire quality of life. He notes that Brian contributes nothing financially to the household that supports him and deflects any attempt to address this with promises of future repayment that never arrive. He calls out Brian's habit of dating women who are young, impressionable, and easily impressed by the performance of depth, then presenting this as proof of his capacity for genuine connection rather than what it actually is. The line that lands hardest in the speech, the one that fans have returned to most consistently in discussions of Brian as a character, is the observation that Brian presents himself as a man who loves women for who they are, while actually pursuing them for what they represent to his self-image. Quagmire freely admits that he dates women for their physical attributes. He says this without shame. The difference between him and Brian, he argues, is that he is honest about it. Brian buys women copies of a famous novel about a cynical prep school student and then lectures them on what the book means with the confidence of someone who believes this constitutes a deep intellectual connection. The novel itself is being used as a prop. The lecture is performance. The woman is an audience for a version of Brian that Brian needs someone to believe in. The speech is funny, and it is also uncomfortable in the way that accurate criticism tends to be uncomfortable when delivered without softening. The show presents Quagmire's assessment as essentially correct, while also noting, through the episode structure, that Quagmire is not himself innocent of many of the things he accuses Brian of. He has pursued Lois. He has been a negligent figure to children he has fathered. His track record with women, stripped of the honesty he credits himself with, is not meaningfully better than Brian's. The speech is correct and hypocritical simultaneously, which is its own kind of honesty about how criticism tends to work. People are most articulate about the flaws they recognize because they share them. Brian's response to the speech is initially defensive and then, briefly, genuinely wounded. He goes home. Stewie, who has a complicated affection for Brian that the show has explored with more depth than almost any other relationship in the series, cheers him up by telling him that he only needs to like himself. The comfort is real, and the moment between them is warm, but it does not address any of the specific points Quagmire raised, because addressing them would require Brian to change something. And changing something would require accepting that the self-presentation has been covering for a reality that is less impressive than advertised. His relationship with ideology follows the same pattern. In the earlier seasons, Brian has clear political positions that feel genuinely held. He advocates for things. He argues against things. He brings a consistent worldview to his interactions with the family and with the broader culture the show depicts. The positions themselves are not always right, but they feel like his, earned through some process of thought and feeling that produced genuine conviction. The episode Excellence in Broadcasting from Season 9 dismantles this. Brian encounters the work of a prominent conservative radio commentator and responds to it by changing his political positions entirely. Not through a process of genuine persuasion, not because specific arguments shifted his thinking on specific issues, but because the performance of intelligence he encounters in the commentary is compelling to him as a performance. He is attracted to the confidence and articulacy of the delivery. He reorients himself around it. His friends and family cannot understand this because they experienced Brian's previous positions as sincere. But the reversal reveals that those positions were also, to some significant degree, performance. Brian holds views that make him feel like the kind of person he wants to be seen as. When he encounters a different kind of intelligence performance and finds it compelling, he adjusts. This is perhaps the most damaging thing the show reveals about Brian over its run. More damaging than the failed novel, or the pretend reading, or the relationships with inappropriate women. His intellectual life, the thing that defines his self-image and separates him from the people he lives with, is substantially aesthetic. He values the look and sound of intelligence. He is drawn to the posture of depth. Whether the content underneath the posture is real matters less to him than whether the posture itself is convincing. Because the posture is what he is actually managing. The content is secondary. His drinking is the other thread the show pulls on repeatedly. Brian is an alcoholic. The show acknowledges this in some episodes and deflects it in others, treating his drinking sometimes as a character problem with real consequences, and sometimes as a background texture of who he is that does not require examination. He has a martini in his hand in a large percentage of his scenes. He has made serious decisions while impaired that affected people around him. In the episode Brian and Stewie, which traps the two of them in a bank vault over a weekend, the show uses the isolation to push into Brian's relationship with alcohol and his sense of his own life with unusual directness. The episode is a significant departure from the show's usual format and lands differently for it, revealing a Brian who is more uncertain and more genuinely unhappy than the confident literary dog of his public self-presentation. The gap between the bank vault Brian and the martini-swilling Brian, who delivers witty observations at the Griffin dinner table, is the same gap that runs through every version of the character. He is more aware of his own failures than he usually lets on. The self-presentation covers something that the private moments reveal. When he is alone with Stewie, or when he is caught without a book title to offer, or when Quagmire is telling him the things that nobody else has been willing to say out loud, the cover slips and the person underneath it is smaller and less certain than the one who usually occupies the space. His interactions with other dogs are their own recurring source of comedy and exposure. Brian moves through the world as a human being in almost every practical sense. He drinks, he reads, he dates, he drives, he has opinions about art and politics and the state of contemporary culture. And then something happens that reminds both him and the audience that underneath all of this, he is a dog. And his response to that reminder is almost always disproportionate. He does not want to be a dog. Being a dog conflicts with the self he has constructed. When his dog instincts surface, when he chases something or responds to a noise, or behaves in a way that cannot be attributed to his curated human identity, he is embarrassed and quick to redirect attention away from what just happened. The irony is that his dog moments are often more honest than his human ones. When Brian chases something, he is being exactly what he is. When Brian tells someone he has been reading Proust, he is being what he wishes he were. The show has more warmth for the chasing Brian than the Proust Brian, even though it spends more time with the Proust version. His relationships with women across the seasons constitute a long record of the same mistake repeated with different people. He meets someone. He is drawn to them through some combination of physical attraction and the specific quality of attention they pay to him, which is almost always the attention of someone who finds his performance convincing. He pursues them with the tools he has, which are the literary references and the deep conversation and the projection of emotional complexity. The relationship develops. Something goes wrong, usually connected to one of Brian's actual qualities rather than his performed ones, and the relationship ends. He moves on to the next person. He does not substantially adjust his approach because the approach is not something he examines. He examines the specific failure each time and finds reasons external to himself. The pattern continues. Rita, a 50-year-old woman he genuinely loves in the Season 8 episode Brian's Got a Brand New Bag, is the exception that demonstrates how the pattern works. He cares about Rita in a way that does not seem primarily performative. He defends her when the Griffin family makes jokes about her age, which costs him socially in the household, but which he does anyway. The relationship is not built on Brian's usual architecture of impressing someone with his depth. It is built on something simpler, and the show treats it with more warmth than his other relationships as a result. It ends, as his relationships tend to, but for reasons that are not entirely his fault, which makes it the cleanest counter-argument to Quagmire's catalog. Brian is capable of something real. He does not always choose it, but the capacity is there. He is not the worst Griffin. He is not the dumbest one. His actual intelligence, stripped of the performance that surrounds it, is real and functional, and sometimes genuinely useful to the people around him. He is often the one who sees what is happening in a situation before anyone else does. He tries to intervene in Peter's worst ideas, usually unsuccessfully. He cares about Stewie in a way that the show has made into one of its most reliable emotional anchors. But the self-presentation does real damage, both to Brian's own development and to the people who encounter the presentation and then find the reality. Quagmire's speech lands because it is delivered to someone who has been told, in various softer ways, some version of the same thing before and has absorbed none of it. The novel failed. The reading did not exist. The ideology shifted with the wind. The women left. Brian went back to his martini and his half-finished manuscript and the version of himself that the manuscript represents, the writer, the intellectual, the dog who is more than a dog, and started again from where he always starts. Peter cannot find him in the bookshelf because there is nothing in it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's failures are rooted in the gap between self-image and reality, a gap he maintains through sustained performance. The next section covers the Griffin, whose gap runs in the opposite direction, a character with genuine capabilities that keep collapsing at the worst possible moments, usually at his own hand. Section 8. Stewie Griffin and the genius that keeps failing itself. Building a time machine before learning to walk is an unusual sequence of developmental milestones. Stewie Griffin managed it. By the time the show's second season was airing, the youngest Griffin had constructed a fully functional device capable of moving him and selected companions across any point in the historical timeline, powered by components he sourced, assembled, and calibrated himself in a bedroom that also contained a crib, a mobile, and a stuffed bear named Rupert. The time machine worked. It kept working across more than a decade of episodes, transporting Stewie and Brian to 1939 Germany, to the moment of the Big Bang, to 17th century Jamestown, to the Titanic, to various points in their own personal timelines where past decisions could theoretically be adjusted. The engineering was sound. The applications were the problem. Stewie's genius is real. This is not a case like Brian's, where the intelligence is substantially a performance covering a more ordinary interior. The weapons Stewie designs function. The plans he constructs are architecturally coherent. The surveillance systems, the vehicles, the biological experiments, the portal technologies, the various devices he has built and deployed across the show's run, these are not props. They work in the world of the show. A baby with an IQ that presumably dwarfs everyone else in the Griffin household has been producing functional advanced technology since the series began, and the technology has consistently done what he built it to do. The problem is everything that happens after the technology works. Stewie's genius operates at the level of construction and design. At the level of application, judgment, and consequence management, he operates somewhere closer to what the technology produces in the hands of someone with no experience of outcomes. He builds the time machine perfectly. He then uses it to go back in time and embarrass Brian during an old date. He builds a portal perfectly. He then uses it to get into a situation that requires the portal to get out of, at which point the portal is on the wrong side of the situation. He designs a robot with exceptional technical specifications, and the robot immediately does something the specifications did not account for, usually involving Stewie personally. The show's first 3 seasons built Stewie as a genuinely menacing figure. His primary stated goal was the death of Lois, and the show presented this not as a toddler's tantrum dressed up in elaborate vocabulary, but as the sincere ambition of a small person with actual capabilities and an actual plan. He stalked her. He built weapons designed specifically to end her life. He delivered monologues about what he was going to do to her that were funny because of the contrast between the baby delivering them and the content being delivered, but which the show also treated as having some grounding in reality. Stewie was not pretending to be dangerous. He was dangerous, in a show where dangerous things happen and occasionally stick. Brian once pointed out, in an exchange that the show treats as the real turning point for Stewie's villainy, that Stewie never follows through. He talks about killing Lois. He plans it. He has the weapons. He has the access. He has the motivation, rooted in what the show presents as a genuine psychological reality about the baby's feelings toward his mother. And then, he does not do it. Episode after episode, season after season, the plan exists and the execution does not happen. Brian calls this out directly, tells Stewie that he is all talk, and Stewie, stung by the accuracy of this, resolves to prove Brian wrong. This is the setup for the 2-part Season 6 story, Stewie Kills Lois, and its follow-up episode, Lois Kills Stewie, which aired in November 2007. Stewie finally acts. He follows Lois onto a cruise ship, shoots her, and watches her go overboard. Lois is gone. The show runs a full episode in which Stewie navigates the aftermath of having actually done the thing he has been threatening to do since the series began. He takes over the world. He achieves the ambitions that have been his stated purpose from the start. The second episode depicts him as a genuine global power, a baby who has seized control of governments and militaries and bent the international order to his will. And then, the show pulls the entire thing back. The 2 episodes, both of them, are revealed to be a computer simulation Stewie ran to model the outcomes of his plan before attempting it in reality. None of it happened. Lois is alive. The world domination was a projection. Stewie tells Brian that the simulation showed things did not work out particularly well for him, and that his plans for matricide and global control will have to wait. He and Brian then make a joke about how the audience might find this reveal irritating, comparing it to a famous television ending that left viewers feeling their investment had been wasted. The show is aware of what it has done. It does it anyway. The decision to retcon the entire 2-episode arc as a simulation is the most concentrated version of something the show has been doing with Stewie for years. His plans reach a certain point and then stop. Something intervenes. The intervention is sometimes external and sometimes entirely self-generated, but the result is always the same. The plan does not complete. The goal is not achieved. The genius that constructs the scheme cannot carry the scheme through to its conclusion, and the show has built enough episodes around this pattern that the failure has become as much a part of Stewie's identity as the genius itself. The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, from Season 9, shows this failure operating at the level of literal self-sabotage. Stewie wants to recover the menacing edge that his character had in the show's early seasons, the genuine danger that has softened as the show has moved him toward a different kind of comedy. He builds a machine designed to amplify and restore his evil instincts. The machine malfunctions. The result is not a more evil Stewie, but an evil clone, a separate entity that contains the concentrated darkness Stewie was trying to retrieve, while Stewie himself remains the softer version he was trying to move away from. He spends the episode dealing with the consequences of having accidentally created a version of himself that is capable of things he no longer is, and having to eliminate that version because it has gone further than he intended. The clone episode is structurally perfect as a metaphor for where the character stands at that point in the show's run. Stewie has separated from his own villainous instincts. They are still real. They exist, but they have been externalized into something he has to manage, rather than something he inhabits. The machine that was supposed to reunite him with his dangerous self instead confirmed the split, creating a physical manifestation of the gap between who Stewie says he is and who Stewie actually is at this stage of the show. Season 12's Life of Brian is the episode that brings the consequences of Stewie's genius most brutally home. The episode begins with Stewie deciding to destroy his time machine. This is a significant decision, not a casual one. The time machine has been the source of enormous trouble across its operational history. It has nearly altered history in ways that could not be reversed. It has put Stewie and Brian in danger repeatedly, across timelines and locations where the variables of survival were not reliably in their favor. Stewie is tired of the near misses and decides, reasonably, that the risk is no longer worth carrying. He destroys the machine thoroughly. He takes the remains to a junkyard and has them crushed. Minutes later, while the two of them are setting up a street hockey net they found at the junkyard, Brian is hit by a car. The driver does not stop. Brian is taken to the vet, and the injuries are found to be fatal. The family gathers. Brian says goodbye with the dignity that the show, in its better moments, extends to Brian's genuine emotional depth. He dies. Stewie immediately understands what he has done. Not the destruction of the time machine, which was itself a reasonable decision made for reasonable reasons. What he understands is the timing. He destroyed the machine that could have saved Brian's life minutes before Brian needed saving. This is not a consequence of stupidity. It is a consequence of the universe's indifference to good timing. The kind of thing that happens when a person makes the right call at the wrong moment. Stewie had decided, correctly, that the time machine caused more problems than it solved. He was not wrong about this. The machine had nearly unraveled history on multiple occasions. Destroying it was the rational choice. The rational choice killed Brian. Stewie attempts to rebuild the machine to reverse the outcome, but the components he needs are unavailable. His supplier has been killed under unrelated circumstances. The machine cannot be rebuilt. Brian stays dead for 3 episodes, replaced by a talking Italian dog named Vinny, whose presence the family adjusts to with a speed that the show uses as a joke, but which also quietly underlines how replaceable even the most beloved family member can be when the household needs to keep functioning. Brian returns in the Christmas episode that follows, through a mechanism that involves a different timeline version of Stewie giving the present-day Stewie a time travel device. The reunion is emotionally satisfying in the way the show allows emotional satisfaction, which is to say, it earns the feeling and then moves past it before it can become sentimental. Brian is back. Stewie did not save him by being smart. he saved him by accidentally encountering the tool he needed through a temporal coincidence he did not engineer. The distance between Stewie's capabilities and Stewie's outcomes is the show's most consistent source of comedy in his storylines. He builds things that other characters cannot imagine building. He understands physics, engineering, chemistry, and biology at a level the adult humans around him cannot approach. He speaks multiple languages. He has navigated situations that would defeat any of the other Griffins immediately. And across all of this competence, he has never killed Lois, never achieved sustained world domination, never completed the primary objectives that the show established for him in its opening seasons, and managed to destroy his most powerful tool at the precise moment it would have been most needed. His British accent is itself a version of this pattern, though the show handles it differently. The Season 15 episode, Send In Stewie Please, which is essentially a single-location conversation between Stewie and a therapist played by Patrick Stewart, reveals that the accent is not authentic. Stewie chose it and maintains it as a performance, a constructed identity layer that he wears over whatever the baseline version of himself sounds like. The episode is unusual in the show's catalog because it removes the comedy almost entirely and attempts to do something closer to genuine psychological drama. The therapist probes, Stewie reveals, the accent, the weaponry, the world domination ambitions, the relationship with Rupert. All of these get looked at through a slightly more serious lens than the show normally applies. The episode received mixed responses, partly because Family Guy had not built the emotional foundation that would make such a departure fully convincing, and partly because placing Stewie in a room with a therapist for 20 minutes strips away the comedy scaffolding that usually supports his character and reveals how much of what is interesting about him depends on that scaffolding being present. Without the cutaway gags and the physical comedy and Brian as a scene partner, Stewie alone with his own interiority is a more melancholy figure than the show's usual framing allows. The therapist episode works in moments and strains in others, but it does confirm something the show had been suggesting since the softening of Stewie's villain persona. There is a loneliness underneath the genius, a genuine isolation that the weapons and the plans and the accent and the bear are all, in different ways, responses to. His friendship with Brian is the most honest relationship the show has ever built between two characters. The Road 2 episodes, a series of adventure stories modeled loosely on the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road movie format, place them together across various locations and situations, and allow the show to explore what they actually mean to each other outside the Griffin household's usual dynamics. Brian is the person who takes Stewie seriously as a person rather than as a baby, and Stewie is the person who sees Brian clearly while still choosing to care about him. The clarity is mutual. Each of them knows what the other actually is, not the performed version, but the real one, and the friendship continues anyway. This is rarer in the Griffin household than it should be. The Time Machine's history is, in its own way, a record of good intentions going wrong at scale. Road to Germany, from Season 7, sends Stewie and Brian to 1939 in pursuit of Mort Goldman, who stumbled into the machine by accident. They retrieve Mort and escape Nazi Germany through a series of escalating close calls that includes Stewie posing as Adolf Hitler, which works, and a uranium acquisition in England, which barely works. The timeline is restored. To ensure it stays restored, Stewie eliminates the version of Mort who made the trip, preventing any future contamination of the timeline from that particular loose end. The killing is presented as a logical necessity. Stewie executes logical necessities without apparent emotional difficulty, which is itself a version of his early season menace surviving into the softer era of his character. In the Big Bang Theory episode from Season 9, the Time Machine becomes the instrument through which Stewie discovers he created the universe. He and Brian are fighting over control of the device and travel outside the space-time continuum. Stewie, in the process of trying to manage the situation they have created, fires a weapon at a particular point in space. The resulting explosion is the Big Bang. The universe, all of it, was created by a baby who was arguing with a dog about who got to operate a time machine they had built without fully thinking through all the places it could take them. This is either a profound statement about the relationship between accident and creation, or a joke about how Stewie's plans consistently produce outcomes larger and stranger than anything he intended. Probably both. He destroys the machine in Season 12 to avoid exactly this kind of uncontrolled outcome. The machine causes more trouble than it solves. The decision is correct. The timing is the worst possible. Brian is dead 3 minutes later. Stewie rebuilds a version of the machine eventually because the show cannot permanently remove a tool that has generated so much story. He continues using it. The near misses continue. The primary objectives, the elimination of Lois, the achievement of world domination, remain unaccomplished. The British accent remains in place. Rupert sits in the corner of the room where the crib is, next to the equipment that would terrify any parent who opened the door and looked at what their infant has built in there, understanding none of it, and closed the door again quietly. Lois has closed that door many times. She is still alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stewie's genius keeps colliding with outcomes he did not design and cannot fully control. The next section looks at what happens when every member of the Griffin family combines their particular forms of bad judgment into a single shared disaster, and how the show has returned to this collective collapse again and again across its entire run. Section 9. 6 people making everything worse together. The Griffins won the Rhode Island lottery in the Season 10 premiere, Lottery Fever, and spent everything before the family had finished processing what winning meant. Peter quit his job the next morning. The money did not change who the Griffins were. It removed the budget that had been keeping the scale of their bad decisions at a level the household could survive. With unlimited funds, Peter shot his friend Joe in the eye with a BB gun because Joe asked not to be aimed at in the face. That is what the lottery produced. Not security, not opportunity, not comfort. A man with a BB gun and no remaining sense of proportion. Peter quits his job at the brewery the morning after the win. He does this with a speech to his boss Angela that is, by his standards, surprisingly composed. Delivered with the deliberate courtesy of a man who has rehearsed something and is proud of how it is coming out. The composure lasts until the very end of the speech, at which point he announces he has left something large and inappropriate on her desk and leaves. The exit is very Peter. He gets almost all the way to dignity and then turns at the last second. Lois announces, before the win has been fully processed, that the family should not let the money change them. She says this with the authority of the household's rational center, the person whose job it is to set the terms for how the family navigates a new situation. The money immediately changes all of them. Chris hires a butler to bring him vintage glue for sniffing, which is its own sentence worth sitting with. Lois receives a blood diamond ring and accepts it without extensive reflection on the ethical supply chain. Stewie has a giant cradle-mobile installed in the sky outside the house so he can relax on the lawn looking up at it. These are the mild adjustments. Peter's adjustments are where the episode concentrates its energy. He gives his friends Joe and Quagmire money. This sounds generous. The generosity comes with conditions that reveal themselves quickly. The money is not a gift between friends. It is a power transaction. payment for an audience Peter can perform in front of without consequence. He orders Joe and Quagmire to do things on his instruction and pays for the privilege of their compliance. The escalation from mild humiliation to serious harm accelerates through the episode until Peter, in possession of a BB gun and apparently no remaining sense of proportion, shoots Joe in the eye because Joe asked him not to aim at faces. He then shoots Quagmire in the throat for complaining about the eye. These are two of his oldest friends. He maims them for objecting to being shot. The lottery money runs out. The show indicates this happened somehow, through a person named Kyle, whose specific role in the financial collapse is never explained. And the Griffins return to their previous economic situation, having spent an enormous amount of money in a very short time on things that did not include any form of investment or security planning. Life returns to what it was before the ticket. The only lasting change is that Joe Swanson lost an eye, and Quagmire has a throat injury that the show does not track into future episodes. Lottery Fever is the show's most direct examination of what the Griffins are like when the ordinary pressures of managing a household on a limited income are removed. The answer is worse. The financial constraint was not causing the dysfunction, it was containing it, keeping the scale of their bad decisions limited by what they could actually afford to execute. Give them unlimited resources, and Peter shoots his friends in the face. Give them a budget, and he merely declares a sovereign nation and eats himself into a stroke. The budget is, in a meaningful sense, a safety mechanism for everyone within a radius of whatever Peter is currently planning. The I Never Met the Dead Man episode, the second episode of the entire series, establishes this collective dynamic early and with surprising efficiency for a show that was still finding its format. Peter is teaching Meg to drive. His advice during the driving lesson is exactly as bad as everything else Peter does, and Meg, following it, fails her driving test. Peter then drives her home himself, and, in the course of this return trip, crashes into a satellite dish. The crash disrupts Quahog's cable signal. The city loses television. For Peter, the loss of television is initially devastating and then transformative. He goes through what the show frames as withdrawal, an actual physical and psychological process of detoxification from his primary source of stimulation. Coming out the other side, he discovers the world outside the house. He starts going on outdoor excursions. He becomes enthusiastic about nature and physical activity and family time in the actual physical world. He drags the rest of the family with him everywhere. He wakes them early. He schedules activities. He is energized and present in a way that the television-watching Peter never is. The family is miserable, every single one of them. The outdoor activities Peter organizes are exhausting and unwanted and relentless. Lois, who spends most of the show's run wishing Peter would engage more with the family and the world around him, finds that engaged Peter is worse than disengaged Peter, because engaged Peter is at maximum volume in their shared physical space, with no off switch. The children suffer through activities they did not choose and cannot escape. Brian endures. What begins as Peter's liberation from television becomes the family's imprisonment in Peter's liberation from television, which is its own kind of punishment. The resolution comes when Stewie's weather control device, which he built to eliminate the world's broccoli supply and has been deploying throughout the episode, produces a storm whose lightning strike hits Meg during a driving lesson with Lois. The lightning also hits Peter. Peter ends up in a hospital bed, where the only available entertainment is a television, and his addiction immediately reasserts itself. He becomes the familiar Peter again. The family is relieved. The outdoor activities end. Cable is presumably restored to Quahog at some point, and the Griffin household returns to its default configuration. The episode demonstrates something the show returns to across its entire run. The Griffins function best, or at least most stably, when everyone is doing approximately nothing. Peter watching television, Lois managing the household, the children occupying their own spaces, Brian drinking and not finishing his novel. The system works in the loosest possible sense when everyone stays in their lane. The disasters happen when someone steps outside their lane and forces everyone else to adjust to the new configuration. Peter without television is a disaster. Peter without diplomatic immunity was a disaster. Lois without groceries money was a disaster. The family without Brian for 3 episodes was a disaster. The common thread is not incompetence, but disruption. The removal of whatever steady-state condition was keeping the chaos at a manageable level. Into Fat Air from Season 11 takes the collective failure to its most geographically extreme setting. The Griffins climb Mount Everest. This is not a decision that emerges from careful planning or genuine athletic aspiration. It emerges from the family's competitive response to the quagmires doing something impressive, which is a recurring source of motivation for Peter specifically. Lois becomes involved and invested in a way that reflects her own competitive instincts, which run alongside her more controlled public presentation, and frequently override it when the situation activates them strongly enough. The Everest attempt goes wrong in ways that the extreme environment ensures will be serious rather than merely inconvenient. Altitude, cold, physical exhaustion, and the basic fact that the Griffins are not people who should be on Everest combine to produce a situation where the family's ordinary dysfunction operates at the scale that a mountain can amplify. Lois goes too far and keeps pushing past what is safe. Peter behaves in ways that are dangerous in a context where dangerous behavior has larger consequences than it does in Quahog. The children manage as best they can, which, given what the children are working with, is not very well. The Everest episode belongs to a category of Griffin collective disasters that the show visits periodically. Episodes where the family has been transported to an environment that their particular combination of traits is especially poorly suited to. Farmer Guy from Season 11 puts the family on a farm after a crime wave in Quahog leads them to seek a quieter life in the country. The farm does not go well. The agricultural environment requires skills, patience, physical endurance, and a relationship to natural systems and processes that the Griffin family does not have and cannot quickly develop. Peter's approach to farming is what his approach to everything is: full commitment to the wrong method, executed with total confidence. The fish out of water structure works for the show because it isolates the family's collective qualities by removing the familiar setting that partially compensates for them. In Quahog, the Griffins are disasters, but they are disasters in an environment that has partially adapted to them. The neighbors know them. The institutions have records of them. The hospital has seen Peter multiple times. The police have a file. There is an infrastructure of consequence management built up around the Griffin family in Quahog that does not exist in a new location. And in a new location, the consequences come faster and land harder. What the collective failure episodes reveal, more clearly than the individual character focus episodes, is how the family members amplify each other's worst qualities rather than compensating for them. The intuitive model of a family is that different members have different strengths that balance out across the unit. Someone is good at planning. Someone is good at execution. Someone keeps the emotional temperature manageable. The Griffins do not work this way. When Peter moves toward a bad decision, Lois's attempts to stop him frequently accelerate the decision rather than halting it. When Lois's own instability surfaces, Peter's response makes it worse. Chris's confusion compounds whatever is already confusing. Meg absorbs and internalizes until she either goes quiet or erupts. Brian observes and comments and occasionally intervenes, but lacks the practical authority to redirect anything. Stewie operates on his own agenda entirely, and the agenda rarely intersects helpfully with whatever crisis the rest of the family is generating. The Season 4 episode, The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire, contains a smaller version of this amplification dynamic. When Quagmire's affair with Cleveland's wife Loretta is discovered, Peter becomes involved in managing the fallout in the way Peter manages things, which is to say, by making it significantly worse. He brings barbershop quartet members to the hospital room where Cleveland has been taken after his emotional collapse, and has them sing about the situation, which is a demonstration of Peter's fundamental inability to read a room or match his response to the emotional register of the people around him. The family watches this happen. Nobody stops it in time. The damage accumulates. Brian's commentary role in these collective disasters deserves its own examination. He is, theoretically, the voice of reason. He sees the problems coming before they arrive, articulates them clearly, and is consistently ignored. His warnings land with the weight that warnings from the family dog tend to carry in a house where the humans have already committed to whatever they are about to do. He said Peter should not eat 30 burgers. He was right. He pointed out that the lottery was a tax on people making poor probability assessments. He was right. He told Stewie, years before the Life of Brian episode, that Stewie never followed through on his plans, a comment that triggered the Stewie kills Lois arc and its simulation reveal. He was right about that too in the end. Being right without the authority to enforce being right is its own form of futility, and Brian's position in the family collective is essentially that. He is the household's most accurate predictor of disaster and its least effective preventer of disaster. The two qualities exist together because the same thing that makes him accurate, his ability to see clearly what is happening and where it is going, does not translate into the ability to make anyone adjust course. Peter will not adjust. Lois will not adjust when she is committed to something. The children are not in positions of authority over their own situations. Stewie is operating on a separate program entirely. Brian sees it all coming and narrates it as it arrives, which is more than any of the others can do, and less than what the family would need to actually change direction. The deepest version of the collective failure dynamic is the one the show runs across entire seasons rather than single episodes. The characters' relationships to each other have been established across hundreds of episodes in ways that make certain outcomes almost structural. Peter will pursue something badly. Lois will attempt to manage the pursuit and partially fail. Brian will predict the failure correctly. Chris will be confused by what happens. Meg will absorb whatever collateral damage is produced. Stewie will be doing something entirely separate that intersects with the main disaster at exactly the wrong moment, usually making it larger. This is not a criticism of the show. It is the show's engine. The predictability of the structure is part of what makes individual episodes work, because the audience brings expectations that the writers can satisfy or subvert based on what a specific story needs. A completely unpredictable family would not generate the same comedy, because the comedy depends on recognition, on the audience knowing these people well enough to anticipate their choices and find the specific execution of those choices funny in their particulars, even when the general shape is familiar. The Griffins have been failing collectively for more than 25 years of broadcast television. The failure has been consistent enough to become one of the most recognizable dynamics in animated comedy, referenced and parodied across other shows and in popular culture broadly. Peter has become synonymous with a specific kind of confident incompetence. Lois has become the template for the reasonable person whose reasonableness has limits that the show enjoys testing. Chris has become the standard for a particular brand of gentle bewilderment. Meg has become shorthand for being the one who gets the worst of everything. Brian has become the model for performed intelligence masking ordinary limitations. Stewie has become the image of capability that consistently undermines itself at the critical moment. Together, they constitute a family whose collective intelligence is genuinely less than the sum of its parts. Each individual Griffin, operating alone, would probably produce fewer disasters than the same Griffin operating within the family system. The family does not make them better. It makes them more themselves, which in every case is worse than the baseline. Peter around his family is more Peter than Peter alone would be. Lois around her family has less room to manage her instability than she would have if she were managing only herself. The system runs hot, and it stays hot, and the episodes are the product of what happens when a system running hot is pointed at a new problem every week. Lottery fever ends. The money is gone. Kyle, whoever he is, has played some role in the financial collapse that the show declines to explain. Joe has one fewer eye than he started the season with. Quagmire's throat heals off-screen. The family goes back to the budget that was the only thing keeping Peter from shooting his friends in the face with a BB gun. And the next season begins with the same household, the same people, the same relationships, and the same structural guarantee that whatever comes next will go worse than it should. This is the promise the show has been making since 1999. The Griffins will attempt something. It will not go well. The particular way it fails will be specific to who they are and how they make each other worse. And then, because the system resets, because the show requires the family to remain intact and available for the next episode, it will go back to almost normal, and the cycle will begin again from a starting point that looks, deceptively, like stability. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The collective Griffin failure operates on repetition, the same structure producing new disasters each week because the people inside it never genuinely change. The final section examines what that repetition has built over more than 2 decades and what it means that the show's most reliable joke has always been the same joke, told about the same people with the same punchline waiting at the end. Section 10. What it costs to live next to the Griffins. Joe Swanson is the only resident of Spooner Street who pays for his own cable. This is a real piece of canonical information from the show, a detail embedded in the background mythology of the neighborhood without commentary or explanation. Everyone else on the street has found a way around paying for television service. Joe, a decorated police officer who takes legal and civic obligations seriously, even when surrounded by people who do not, pays his bill. This small fact says more about Spooner Street's relationship to basic civic responsibility than any single episode could, because it is not played as a joke. It is just the situation. One person on the block pays for cable. His neighbors do not. His neighbors are the Griffin family. Spooner Street sits west of downtown Quahog, Rhode Island, a fictional city modeled loosely on Cranston, a suburb of Providence. The show has placed the Griffin family at 31 Spooner Street since its first episode in 1999 and has never moved them, despite multiple incidents that would, in a functioning municipality, result in the family being removed from the property by legal or structural necessity. The house has been at the center of a sovereign nation. It has existed, due to a mapping error, outside the legal boundaries of the United States. Peter has sold or temporarily lost the deed to it on multiple occasions. The original purchase, according to the show's own internal mythology, was funded through a lawsuit involving a broken condom that produced Chris. The house was acquired through an accident and has been generating them ever since. What the neighborhood of Spooner Street has absorbed across more than 25 years of the show is not adequately captured by any single episode or incident. The damage is cumulative, building across seasons into a picture of a residential block that has been subjected to one family's particular form of chaos so consistently and for so long that the chaos has become the defining characteristic of the address. The neighbors who have stayed, primarily Joe Swanson and Glenn Quagmire, have remained through incidents that would send most people to a real estate agent before the episode ended. Their continued presence on Spooner Street is either a testament to community loyalty or an indication that Quahog's property values have been so thoroughly damaged by Griffin proximity that moving is not a financially viable option. Joe Swanson arrived at the house next door to the Griffins at the start of the show and has been absorbing the consequences of that decision ever since. His introduction in the first season establishes him immediately as the neighborhood's most capable and accomplished person, a police officer who lost the use of his legs in the line of duty and has continued doing everything a person with full mobility does, often better. He plays sports at an elite level. He brings professional competence to his work. He maintains functional domestic relationships under difficult circumstances. His personal story, stripped of the Griffin family's involvement in it, is genuinely admirable. With the Griffin family's involvement in it, his story becomes a catalog of things done to a person who deserved better. Peter annexed his backyard during the Pretoria experiment, planting a flag in Joe's property and declaring it sovereign territory of a micronation that Peter had founded in a fit of bureaucratic loophole exploitation. The annexation was not brief. Joe had to navigate the situation as a homeowner whose yard had been absorbed into a neighboring country without his consent, while also being a police officer who technically had no jurisdiction over a sovereign nation, even one that consisted of the house next door. The situation resolved only when economic sanctions against Pretoria made Peter's position untenable, at which point the backyard was returned without the kind of formal acknowledgement that having your yard involuntarily annexed probably warrants. During the Lottery Fever episode, Peter used newfound wealth to buy the compliance of his friends. Joe was among the friends whose compliance was purchased. He was given money. He was asked to perform for Peter's entertainment. When he asked Peter not to aim at his face, Peter shot him in the eye. Peter had a BB gun and access to a friend who was not in a position to physically stop him, and Peter used the BB gun on his friend's eye because his friend had requested a basic limit that Peter found inconvenient. Joe lost an eye in that episode, and the show did not bring it back. His request was reasonable. Peter's response was not. This is the arithmetic of living next to the Griffins. Peter once bought a talking parrot, and before the parrot had been in his possession long enough to learn anything from anyone else, taught it the word cripple, specifically so the parrot would say this word in Joe's presence. Joe reacted with appropriate dismay. The parrot did not know it was doing anything wrong. The parrot had been taught one thing by one person and was doing that thing. The person who taught it was Peter, who lives next door, and who found teaching his neighbor's parrot to insult his neighbor's disability to be a worthwhile use of the parrot's learning capacity. Joe's reaction to watching this happen is one of the show's smaller and more honest portraits of what it is like to be on the receiving end of Peter Griffin's complete indifference to the effect of his actions on other people. Glenn Quagmire's tenure on Spooner Street has been shaped by Griffin adjacency in ways that are harder to catalog, precisely because Quagmire and Peter have a more genuinely reciprocal relationship than Peter has with most people. They are actual friends, in the sense that Peter has a few people whose company he prefers and whose presence in his life he values, and Quagmire is one of them. This does not protect Quagmire from the consequences of proximity. In the Jerome is the New Black episode, Peter threw a bottle through the window of a house in a fit of jealous rage. The bottle knocked over a lamp. The lamp started a fire. The fire burned the house down completely. The house was not Quagmire's. It was Jerome's, a new friend who had nothing to do with whatever emotional spiral Peter was managing at that moment. Jerome escaped unharmed. His house did not survive. Peter was never identified as the person responsible, and the show noted this without resolving it. The arson went unaddressed. Jerome moved into the Griffin house temporarily, which was its own kind of consequence for everyone involved. Cleveland Brown, the third member of the original Spooner Street neighbor configuration, eventually left. The Cleveland show ran for 4 seasons on Fox, following Cleveland to Stool Bend, Virginia, where he built a new life with his childhood sweetheart and her family. His departure from Spooner Street was presented in Family Guy as the loss that prompted Peter, Joe, and Quagmire to begin auditioning replacement friends, an effort that produced Jerome and the house fire, and Quagmire's extended speech about Brian's character. Cleveland came back to Spooner Street eventually after the Cleveland show ended and resumed his place in the neighborhood dynamic. His return was treated as a restoration of a correct configuration rather than as an event requiring explanation. The fact that Cleveland left and came back is significant for what it suggests about Spooner Street's gravitational pull. He had reasons to go. He built something new. He returned anyway. Whether this is a story about the irreplaceable bonds of genuine friendship or about the difficulty of escaping a neighborhood whose property values have been comprehensively damaged by one family's 2-decade residency, is a question the show does not answer directly. It simply depicts the return and moves on. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street has accumulated its own history independently of the people living in it. For a period that encompassed multiple episodes, it was not on any map of Quahog. The mapping error that enabled Pretoria also meant the house did not officially exist within the city limits that would make it subject to Quahog's zoning, taxation, and service infrastructure. Peter could not build his pool because of zoning regulations, and then discovered his house was not in the zone the regulations covered. The pool permit was therefore denied based on rules that did not technically apply. The house sat in administrative limbo that most people would find deeply alarming and that Peter found politically exciting. The Drunken Clam. The bar where Peter and his friends spend significant portions of their lives functions as a secondary hub for Spooner Street's social activity and as another zone of Griffin family damage. Peter has been cut off there. He has caused incidents there. He has used the bar as the setting for decisions whose consequences have extended far beyond the bar itself. The clam knows Peter the way the hospital knows Peter, the way the police station knows Peter, the way every institution in Quahog that has regular contact with him has developed a specific and weary relationship to his presence. He is the customer they recognize and brace for. He is the patient whose file is already thick before he comes in. Quahog's institutional landscape has been shaped by the Griffins in ways that accumulate across seasons. Dr. Hartman at the hospital has treated Peter for injuries caused by the full range of Peter's decisions. Tom Tucker at Quahog 5 News has covered Griffin-adjacent stories often enough that the family's disasters have become local news events. Mayor Adam West, who governed Quahog for the bulk of the show's run, operated in the same absurdist register as the city's most prominent family, which suggests either that Quahog selects for a certain kind of person or that long-term Griffin exposure changes a person's relationship to normal behavior. The mayor named his cat Mittens and conducted the city's affairs with the detached eccentricity of someone who has simply stopped expecting events to make conventional sense. Years of living in the same municipality as the Griffins might produce exactly that adaptation. The neighborhood resets. This is the promise the show has made since its first episode and has kept across every season since. Whatever the Griffins do to Spooner Street, to Joe, to Quagmire, to the institutions of Quahog, to the international order when Peter briefly became a head of state, the block remains. The houses stay standing, the neighbors stay next door. The drunken clam opens the next day. Joe pays for his cable. The parrot probably still knows the one word Peter taught it. Peter comes home. Lois manages the immediate consequences of wherever he has been and whatever he did while he was there. Chris is confused by something. Meg absorbs what the family needs absorbed. Brian narrates the disaster in real time, accurately, and too late to change anything. Stewie is in his room building something that will probably cause a problem. The house at 31 Spooner Street holds all of this together. A structure not on any map for several seasons. Purchased through litigation about a contraceptive failure. Briefly sovereign, perpetually chaotic, and somehow still standing. Joe Swanson pays for the cable that keeps the television running inside the Griffin house because Peter does not pay for it. Peter watches television on Joe's money, sitting in a chair in a house that does not always legally exist, in a neighborhood that has survived him through 25 years of not learning anything and showing no sign of starting. The block absorbs it. The neighbors stay. The next episode begins. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.